Just after midnight on June 17th, 1939, a crowd of people began to form outside of this unremarkable building in Versailles, which is a city in France. The atmosphere in this crowd was electric. They all knew why they were there. They knew what they were about to see, but even still, there was a lot of nervous anticipation. And so as such, some people were coping with these nerves by drinking alcohol and trying to laugh and have a good time, while others were much more subdued and were trying to be respectful about what they were about to witness. Between 1 and 2 a.m., the doors of this unremarkable building opened up, and a group of men dressed in the same dark uniforms came out and didn't say a word to the crowd, and the crowd immediately went silent and began to back away from them. And this group of men, they walked right out in front of this building, and they had lumber and they had tools with them, and they began constructing this kind of strange wooden structure. And so the crowd, they wanted to get up close to see what these guys were doing, but at the same time, they didn't want to get too close. And so as the crowd formed a sort of half moon around these men that were doing the constructing were moving so seamlessly, like all of them had built this structure dozens of times before, and it was just muscle memory. And so by about 3 a.m., this structure was built, and they placed this large basket next to the structure, and then these men packed up their tools and the remaining pieces of lumber, and they turned around and they went right back inside the doors into the building and were gone. At this point, the crowd had become quite sizable outside of this building, and they were growing kind of restless because they knew now that this structure was built that the next time those doors open, the show is really going to start. This spectacle they are all there for, it's about to happen. And the crowd all knew that this event couldn't happen if the sun was up, because if the sun was up and the area was well lit, the press would be able to take pictures and film it, and that's not what officials wanted. They wanted this to happen in the darkness. But for whatever reason, things seemed to be getting delayed inside of this building. And so the crowd was just getting more and more restless. People are getting more and more drunk, and they're getting louder and more disruptive and boisterous. And then around 4:45 a.m., the sun had come up. And so the press was out in full force with their cameras trained at the doors of this building. And so the crowd really at this point is not actually expecting this event to take place, because at this point, it just seems totally unlikely. But at 4:50 a.m., those doors swung open, and standing in the threshold was 31-year-old Eugene Weidman, who was a convicted serial killer. His arms were tied behind his back, and the collar of his white shirt had been tucked down inside because they needed his neck to be free and clear because he was about to be beheaded. So the two guards on either side of Eugene, they pulled him forward out towards the crowd so the executioners behind him, who were dressed all in black, could filter out and take up positions alongside the guillotine, which is that wooden structure that had been built earlier in the morning. And so as Eugene is being brought out towards the crowd and everything is getting set up for his execution, the crowd went wild. They were shrieking and howling and laughing and pointing and booing and just generally being completely rambunctious and totally bloodthirsty. Eugene kept his head down. He did not want to look at the crowd, and he did not want to look at the guillotine. And so eventually the two guards turned him and walked him directly towards the base of the guillotine, at which point the executioners that had taken up their positions around this device, they grabbed him and slid him forward so he was on his stomach on top of this wooden platform, the guillotine, and they slid him forward until his head poked through this opening at the very far end, at which point his neck was positioned right under this huge blade that was dangling right above him, and his head was positioned over a metal bucket on the ground, which he would be looking directly at. At this point, the crowd was at a fever pitch, and one of the executioners pulled a lever. The blade came soaring down, and it removed his head. His head fell into the bin, and the executioners pushed his torso into the basket that had been placed out there earlier, and then the executioners and the prison guards, they gathered up Eugene's body parts and went right back inside of the building, which was a prison. At this point, the crowd was cheering and going wild, and they ran up and began dabbing their scarves and their handkerchiefs in Eugene's blood, which was on the ground, as a sort of souvenir from having been at this execution. And of course, because the sun had been out for this entire spectacle, all of this had been captured on film. And so later that day, and for the next couple of days, the headlines all over France were about this bloodthirsty crowd that was cheering as this man was beheaded, and it just overall made France look really, really bad. And so French leaders leaders decided that from that point forward, they could no longer do any more public executions. So the guillotine would continue to get used for decades beyond this point, but it was all behind closed doors. Also, random fact about being beheaded by a guillotine: your head, after it's been separated from your body, stays conscious for about 10 to 12 seconds, so they say. And apparently there's been lots of cases where the executioner, after the condemned has had their head removed, will yell the name of the person who has just had their head removed, and that person's head will look over at the person calling to them and will blink or try to mouth words for several seconds before the lack of oxygen kills the brain and then the head is no longer conscious. Here are some of the more notable pictures that were used in the media from Eugene Weidmann's execution. In the early 1900s, Eben Byers was a man who other people envied. He was born into a very wealthy family in New York City. He attended Yale University in Connecticut, which is a very prestigious Ivy League university, and he was devilishly handsome. After his college graduation, he didn't need a job because his family was so rich, and so instead he focused his time on a passion of his, which was golfing. And in time, he became this world-class golfer, going so far as to win the 1906 U.S. Amateur Tournament, which is the biggest amateur golf tournament in the world that most of the winners go on to become professional golfers. And so Eben most likely would have followed that path and become a pro golfer had his father not just handed over the very successful metalworking business that he started that made his family wealthy in the first place. And so Eben stopped his golf career and became the chairman of this incredibly successful company. And so overnight, he basically went from being just rich to being uber rich, making more money than he could possibly spend. But Eben did attempt to spend his money. He pretty much immediately began buying up luxury properties all over the country. He bought horse racing stables in the United Kingdom and in America, and he bought an entire luxury box at Forbes Field, which is where the Pittsburgh Pirates professional baseball team used to play. And so in addition to owning all these incredible things, Eben also, through his role as chairman of this company, began connecting with and befriending very powerful and influential people like the founders and executives at the Coca-Cola Company. And so all in all, Eben's life was really going quite well until 1927. That year, Eben was 47 years old, and he took some time off from gallivanting around the world and rubbing shoulders with famous people to go catch a football game at his alma mater at Yale University. So he hops on a train, he rides to Connecticut, he watches this game, and then afterwards he gets back on the train to head back to Pittsburgh. And this is a very long ride. It's over 12 hours long. And so Eben naturally bought a first-class ticket, and so he was inside of a train car that had bunk beds for passengers to sleep on during the ride. And so Eben climbed into a top bunk and he fell asleep. A few hours later, after the train is well on its way to Pittsburgh, Eben, in his sleep, manages to roll to the side of the bed and actually falls out of his bed onto the ground. He lands hard on his left side, it wakes him up, and as he stands up, he thinks he's okay, but then he feels this shooting pain in his left arm. So he's moving his arm around, he's not really sure what's wrong with it, but he's hoping it's just some bruising, and so he decides to get back into his bunk and just go back to sleep. And so he manages to fall asleep despite the pain, and then when they roll into the station in Pittsburgh several hours later, he wakes up and right away he feels that pain in his left arm. And so after getting off the train and going back to his house and dropping off his luggage, he went right to his physical therapist's office to ask him if there was anything he could do to help with the pain in his arm. And so the physical therapist examines Eben's shoulder and determines that, there's no structural damage to his arm, but obviously Eben is in pain. And so he says, look, there's a new product that came online that's quite expensive, but since you're a man of means, maybe it's something you want to consider. It's called Radithor, and it's supposed to dull aches and pains, and it's supposed to give you this huge boost of energy. And so, maybe you want to try that. And so Eben was really excited at the notion of taking this new health tonic and said, yeah, let's do it. And so his physical therapist wrote him a prescription for Radithor. Eben took the prescription and he went to the drugstore. He picked up a half-ounce bottle of this liquid. He went back to his house and, as prescribed, he drank a very small spoonful of this liquid. And right away, he felt this surge of energy, the pain in his arm started to fade, all the things this health tonic claimed to be able to do, it was doing. And so over the next couple of days, Eben very diligently every day took the prescribed amount, a very small spoonful of this Radithor, and every day he felt better and better and better. Not just the pain in his arm, but overall, he felt happier, he felt fitter, he felt alive, and he was attributing all those feelings to this miracle tonic. And so he began taking more and more of this tonic, well beyond what was prescribed, to the point where he was drinking 3 full bottles of Radithor every single day. And so for years he did this, and it was all going great until his jaw fell off. Literally, in 1931, one day, his lower jaw just separated from his skull and went slack. And so the reason this happened was because Radithor was actually just radioactive water. In the early 1900s, the radioactive element radium was believed to have highly curative properties with no side effects. And so naturally, at the time, dozens of health products were created with radium being their main ingredient. And Radithor was one of those products. It was literally just water and radium. And so after consuming over 1,400 bottles of Radithor over a 3-year period, Eben's body was finally just starting to disintegrate from the inside out. After he had his jaw surgically removed, along with large portions of his upper jaw, the rest of his body also just began to crumble. And so by the end of 1931, when his story was making headlines all around the world about the dangers of Radithor, and really more specifically, the dangers of radium, Eben had become completely bedridden, and his skull was now beginning to disintegrate. There were holes forming all over his skull that were exposing portions of his brain. And so by 1932, Eben was dead. Eben was buried in Pittsburgh, and he was buried inside of a lead-lined coffin that was designed to absorb any of the radiation emitting from his bones. And then 30 years after he was buried, so in 1965, scientists actually exhumed his skeleton to see if it was still emitting radiation. And they determined it was still emitting the same levels of radiation as when he died. And they actually would ultimately figure out that radium, this radioactive element, has a half-life of 1,600 years. So what that means is Eben's body will remain highly radioactive for centuries. Here is a picture of Eben with his jaw surgically removed. It was taken shortly before he passed away. There is still some debate about what exactly happened in this story that I'm about to share with you. And so for transparency, in this video, I am going to rely on the narrative that was presented in court by the defendant. And so with that in mind, here we go. On the afternoon of December 3rd, 2012, a freelance photographer working for the New York Post newspaper named Umar Abbasi was walking down the stairs of the 49th Street subway station in New York City. This very busy station is located only a few blocks away from the very famous Times Square. And so after Umar made his way down to this underground subway station, he walked over to one of the big automated kiosks that looks like an ATM, and he purchased a subway ticket. And then with his ticket, he walked over to the turnstiles. He slid his ticket through the slot, pushed past the turnstiles, and was now standing out on the actual train platform. And from where Umar was standing, this platform basically was like a huge sidewalk that stretched all the way to his right a couple hundred feet and all the way to his left a couple hundred feet. And in front of this platform were the actual tracks down below, because the train, when it came out of the tunnel, it would actually come right up alongside this platform with almost no clearance between the platform and the train. As such, the leading edge of the platform, basically the lip of the train platform that's closest to the train tracks, has this big yellow line painted all across it to keep commuters from standing too close to the edge, because if the train came through, they could actually get hit by the train. And so as Umar is standing on this platform and he's looking left and right, it's totally crowded with people, and they're all kind of tucked back against the wall away from this yellow line. And so Umar decides he's going to turn right and wait at the right end of the platform, just because he saw down at the far end there appeared to be a gap in people, and he figured he could stand right there. And so Umar begins navigating past all of these people on the right side of the platform, and for the most part, everyone everyone he is passing either has their head buried in their phone or they're listening to music or both. Because the thing about riding trains, especially trains in busy cities, is none of the commuters want to talk to anybody else. They want to be completely left alone. And so as Umar is walking, everyone was basically doing that. But at some point, he did pass two people that were engaged in a pretty heated conversation. Umar had no idea what they were arguing about, or if they were even arguing at all. He didn't know who these people were, but he took mental note of the fact that two men were kind of bickering with each other. And so he walked past them, didn't give it much of a second thought, and he arrived at a gap in the gaggle of people waiting for the train. And there he just stood well back of the yellow line, where he pulled out his camera and began clicking through the images he had taken earlier in the day at an earlier photo shoot. And so as he's clicking through these pictures, he starts to notice that those two men who had been bickering before are now straight up yelling at each other. They're screaming obscenities at each other. It's not clear who's fighting about what or who was the aggressor, but it's very obvious that at this point they're fighting. And so Umar looked away from his camera and looked left down the platform towards these two guys. And so these two guys are about 100 to 125 feet away from him. And all the people that were standing in the vicinity of these two men are beginning to migrate away from them. They just don't want anything to do with them. Because the thing about being in subways, especially in cities like New York, is there's lots of people that go down into these train stations that are inebriated or mentally unstable. And so very strange and bad behavior is just kind of a normal thing, and people tend to just kind of ignore it. And so that's what's happening. People are kind of walking away from these two fighting men, doing their best to pretend it's not happening. And so Umar spent a couple more seconds staring down the platform at these two men, but eventually just shrugged and thought, you know what, whatever problems they have, they're not mine. And so Umar went back to his camera and continued to click through his pictures when all of a sudden he hears a scream coming from the left side of the platform. But it was not a scream that sounded like it came from either of these two men. And so Umar looked up from his camera and looked left down the platform, and now he just sees chaos. It's people running away from these two men. People are running to get away from whatever is happening around them. And so Umar's thinking these men must have come to blows and they're now fighting actively, physically with each other. But when finally the crowd kind of cleared for a second, he saw a woman pointing down at the train tracks right in front of where those two men had been standing. And so Umar looks at the woman and he follows her finger down onto the tracks, and he sees there is now a man, one of the two men who had been fighting, laying face down on the train tracks. And then, to Umar's horror, he looks up down the tunnel where the train would come out of, and he sees the headlights of the train. It is now coming into the station. And so Umar starts running down the platform to try to get to this man to pull him out of the tracks. And as he's running, he pulls out his camera and he turns the flash on and he holds the shutter down and he aims it at the train conductor to hope the flashing of his camera will alert the train conductor to put on the emergency brake and stop the train before he hits this guy down on the tracks. And so as Umar is running, trying to signal this train conductor, the man down on the tracks tries to stand up, and Umar sees he's really struggling to stand. And when he finally gets up, he turns and he grabs the edge of the platform and he tries to pull himself up and out of the tracks, but he doesn't have the strength or the coordination. And as Umar is getting closer and closer, but he's still too far away to help, he sees that this guy down on the tracks is not going to be able to get out of there before the train hits him. And so Umar finally comes to a stop and he watches as this man down on the tracks lets go of the lip of this platform and just turns and faces the train like he knows what's about to happen. And then seconds later, the train, although it did try to stop, impacted this man and killed him instantly. The man's name was Kaisar Khan, and he was 58 years old. When the police finally showed up, they arrested the other man who Han had been fighting with. He was a 30-year-old named Naeem Davis, and Davis would actually tell police that he had been fighting with Han and he had pushed him onto the tracks, but it was in self-defense. However, that self-defense story didn't stop him from being charged with murder. While Davis sat in jail waiting for his trial, the media and the public at large had already come to the conclusion that Davis was guilty. And this was due in large part to a particular picture. As Umar was running down the platform, holding up his camera, holding the flash down, trying to flag the train conductor to get him to stop, Umar was also taking dozens and dozens of pictures. And those pictures were of Han right before he was struck by the train. And so after Umar ultimately discovered he had taken these pictures, he gave them to his employer, the New York Post newspaper, and the day after the incident, they ran on the front page a picture of Han right before he's about to be killed with the headline, "Doomed." And so once the public saw this picture, nobody could believe that Davis was anything other than a cold-blooded killer for pushing this poor innocent man onto the tracks. But as it would turn out, nearly 5 years later, when Davis did finally get his trial, he was acquitted of all charges because it turned out Hahn was very drunk and had picked a fight with Davis, and Davis was filmed on more than one occasion on the platform trying to get Hahn to leave him alone. And so finally, after Hahn began making death threats and then grabbed Davis's shoulder, Davis turned around and pushed him, and Hahn, being drunk, stumbled and fell backwards onto the tracks and then was ultimately killed. Here is the infamous photo of Hahn on the cover of the New York Post newspaper. In 2014, the United States Navy decided it was time to decommission one of their old frigate ships, and so they sent it to a dock to be broken down for scrap. In order for workers to actually be able to access the underside of the ship and actually begin to break it down, they would need to dry dock the ship, which meant the ship would basically drive into this special locking corral where the doors would shut behind it, the water would drain out from underneath, and the ship would be left resting on these huge wooden blocks that elevated it off the ground. And with no water in there, workers were able to get underneath the hull and could access every part of the ship without obstruction. It's important to note for this story that when a ship is in dry dock, there is only one way on or off. It's this ramp called a gangway that leads from the dock onto the deck of the ship. Besides that, there is nowhere else for you to get on this ship. And if for some reason you really wanted to get on and couldn't use the gangway, you could in theory try to run and leap from the dock to the ship. There's a pretty significant gap there all the way around, but you could try the jump. But if you weren't successful at grabbing onto the ship, you would fall multiple stories, probably to your death, because there's no water in the dry dock. So this old frigate ship that was being decommissioned was officially dry docked in July of 2014. The first group of people that went on board the ship to begin dismantling it were military personnel. They were in charge of removing all of the sensitive equipment before civilians were allowed to go on board. The military personnel begin to wrap up, and it's getting late in the day, and they tell the foreman, who's in charge of all of the civilian workers that are going to be going on and finishing this decommissioning of this ship, they go to the foreman and they say, "Hey, we're done, we're wrapped up for the night, your workers are good to go, they can get on here tomorrow." The foreman would send a message to his boss that night, letting him know that they were on track to start work the next day. The boss would respond and say, "Hey, can you go on there tonight and take pictures of all the different workstations so we know how many people that we need to place in different segments of this big ship?" So the foreman walks onto the ship and proceeds to take hundreds of pictures all over the inside of the ship. Now, the ship itself was pitch black inside. There was no electricity, and it was nighttime. So he had a flashlight the whole time, but whenever he took a picture, he would turn his flashlight off and then use the flash on his camera before going back to his actual flashlight. So all night he's going room to room taking all these pictures, and at some point he realizes he's photographed everything he needs to. So he leaves, he goes back to his office, he uploads the pictures, and he sends them to his boss. His boss wrote back almost immediately and just said, "Who's the guy with the axe?" Now, the foreman has no idea what he's talking about. He was just in the ship by himself for a couple of hours and didn't see anyone. So he reads the email again to make sure he read it correctly, and he sees that his boss has actually attached the picture he is referring to. Here is this guy clearly clutching an axe in a hallway that he was just in. And even creepier is the foreman is looking at where this picture was taken, and it was relatively early on in his photo shoot. And he had walked past the exact area where this guy is poking his head out of, which means the whole time he was down there, this guy with an axe was there with him. They review the security footage of a camera that was aimed directly at the ramp, the one entrance in and out of this ship. And from the time the foreman left, no one else left. So they don't know how he got on or how he got off without being detected, but somehow he did. In July of 2016, a woman living in Chicago, Illinois named Jordan Baranskis opened her eyes and realized she had fallen asleep on the couch the night before. She looked up and the TV was still on, and then she looked down at the other section of the couch and her boyfriend Matt was also asleep on the couch. As much as she wanted to keep sleeping alongside her boyfriend, she had work that day, so she stood up, turned the TV off, and made her way upstairs to get ready. As soon as she got upstairs, the first thing she did is go into her bedroom and get her purse that she left on the foot of her bed. But when she got in the room, her purse wasn't there. So she leaves her bedroom and she starts searching all the rooms upstairs, and she can't find her purse. And she's thinking to herself, I'm certain I had it the night before. I remember rifling through my purse before going downstairs and starting to fold laundry before ultimately falling asleep on the couch. So after spending about 15 minutes looking for the purse unsuccessfully, and now she's starting to stress because she's going to be late for work because she can't find her purse, she goes downstairs and she wakes Matt up and says, hey, I gotta find my purse. I thought I left it upstairs. Apparently I didn't. Can you help me look for it? Matt rolls over. He doesn't really want to get up because he's pretty tired and he doesn't have work, so he doesn't want to wake up right now. And he says, well, are you sure you didn't leave it at the restaurant last night? I mean, if you already looked, it's probably not here. You want to just give him a call and see if you left it there? Jordan was immediately really annoyed by his reaction because she just wanted him to stand up and help her look for the purse because she had work and he could just go back to sleep. And so it started this argument between the two of them where Matt just wanted her to call the restaurant because he was convinced she had it there. And Jordan was like, no, I know I had my purse. I'm positive I had it last night before I fell asleep on the couch with you. So their argument begins to escalate a little bit, and that's when Jordan remembers that they had recently installed a Nest camera downstairs to monitor their dogs whenever they were gone. And she thought, we can just look at the footage on the Nest camera, we can see me walking into the apartment, and I will either have or not have my purse in my hand. And so Jordan opens up her app and she calls Matt over and they go back to the night before, right before they left for the restaurant. She's got her purse in hand, they leave the front door, and then several hours go by and they come back in and very clearly Jordan has her purse in her hand. And Jordan turns to Matt and says, told you so. And Matt's like, okay, fine, let me help you look. And as they're about to put the app down, she realizes on the Nest camera timeline that motion was detected at 3:30 in the morning when they were both clearly asleep on the couch. And so she calls Matt back over and says, here, look, there's motion detected at 3:30 in the morning, and they hit play. After the couple had fallen asleep on the couch with the TV on, a hooded figure emerges from their upstairs hallway and stands at the top of the stairs and just watches the two of them sleep. Before he left, he stole her purse along with a couple of other things from their apartment. And somehow this guy has never been caught, and he's been given the nickname Creeper Ghost. In early 1974, 31-year-old Michael Taylor was living happily with his wife Christine and their 5 children in Ossett, which is a small town in central England. Michael was described as a great father and a great husband who had an excellent sense of humor. In fact, neighbors, whenever they would walk past the Taylor household, would say you could often hear the sound of Michael laughing or the sound of him telling jokes to his family. But in April of that year, everything changed for the Taylor family. Michael had been doing some home repairs when he fell off of a ladder and he hurt his back. The injury itself was fairly minor, but it resulted in chronic pain. And this chronic pain quickly changed how Michael behaved. Michael went from being this cheerful, funny, happy guy to being sad and depressed. And he was so irritable that his family could barely be around him because he would lash out at them. Now, the Taylor family was not a religious family. However, most families who lived in Ossett at that time were. And so when one of Michael's friends found out about how poorly Michael was doing, they approached Michael and said, you know, you really ought to turn to religion for help and for guidance in this difficult time. And they also told him specifically that he really ought to check out this one particular Christian group. It was called the Christian Fellowship Group, and all it was a prayer group for Christians who wanted more religious support beyond just going to church on Sundays. But this friend of Michael's told him that the real draw of this group was the group's leader. Her name was Marie Robinson, and she was this 21-year-old extremely friendly and energetic and charismatic person who just had this incredible way of making all of her members really feel like they belonged. And so Michael's friend was telling him that he really thought Marie could be the difference maker for him, that she could help him get back to normal. And so Michael, he trusted this friend, and he really didn't have much to lose at this point. He was already at rock bottom, and so he agrees to go check this group out. So on September 12th of that year, Michael makes his way to the church where this fellowship group is held. He goes inside and he makes his way to one of the back rooms in the church. And when he goes inside, he sees there's a ring of people sitting in a circle, about 20 people. And as soon as they see Michael coming in the room, they all stand up and they open their arms up and they say, "Come on, come sit down with us. Welcome to the group." And then the woman who had to be Marie, she stands up and she looks at Michael, huge smile on her face, and she encourages him to come over and sit right next to me. "Welcome, we'd love to have you join our group." And so Michael, for the first time in ages, is smiling as he strides across the room and sits down right next to Marie. And then as Marie began to lead the group in prayer, Michael did not feel his chronic pain. He just felt happy again. But when the meeting was over and Michael went back home again, the pain and depression came flooding back. It was like the only place he could be happy was inside of the church at this fellowship group. And so over the next couple of weeks, Michael completely prioritized this group. He went to all of their meetings, and over the course of these couple of weeks, Michael became very close with Marie, and apparently Marie became very close with Michael, to the point where the two of them would stay after the meetings were over, and just those two would sequester themselves in quiet prayer. No one knew what they did in there, but it just seemed like they were developing a real relationship. And in fact, many people in this group suspected they were having an affair. And before long, the rumors in the church had spread outside and were all over Osset. And then before long, Christine, Michael's wife, was hearing from a friend or a neighbor that apparently Michael was having an affair with Marie. Now, Christine had already suspected her husband was having an affair with Marie because Marie was the only thing Michael talked about when he got home. So on October 1st of that year, only a couple of weeks after Michael had first attended this group, Christine waited until Michael had left the house to head out to one of the group meetings, and then Christine hopped in her car and she followed him to the church. And when she got there, she parked her car, she took a deep breath, and then she got out, she made her way to the front doors of the church, and she stormed inside, and she found the room where these meetings were held. She barges in, and she points at her husband, and she says, "I know you're having an affair with Marie, and you're gonna admit it in front of this whole group." And Michael, who's sitting with his back to his wife in one of the chairs, he stands up, and instead of addressing his wife, who's accused him of infidelity, he turns and looks at Marie on the other side of the room. And when Marie made eye contact with Michael, she screamed. She would later say Michael did not look human. He looked like a beast and he had wild eyes. And so as Michael is standing there staring at Marie with this very aggressive face, he began breaking out in tongues. Speaking in tongues is where the speaker will be saying or uttering words or sounds that sound like language, but the speaker doesn't know what they mean. The idea is some entity has come inside of their body, and this entity is dictating their speech. And so Michael is broken out in tongues, and he's barking these words and sounds at Marie, and everyone inside of the room has no idea what to make of this. Everything has happened so suddenly, and it's so surprising. You have the wife suddenly coming in and aggressively accusing her husband of cheating, and Michael is not responding to it, and he's acting totally crazy. And then before anyone can do anything, Michael goes from just barking in strange languages at Marie to suddenly rushing across the room as if he's going to attack her. And when he does that, the rest of the members jump on top of him and hold him down. And despite there being like 10 or 15 people holding him down, Michael is still trying to get up, and he's screaming and snarling and yelling at Marie. And then Marie suddenly breaks out into tongues too. And it's only then that Michael stops trying to force himself up out of this pig pile that's on top of him, and instead he just continues to speak in tongues to her. And so the two of them are looking at each other, speaking in tongues, and the rest of the group is just totally dumbfounded, and so they just begin praying. And then after about an hour, Michael just collapses. It's like he went unconscious. And at that point, everybody in the room just goes silent, and they look at Michael, And then Michael kind of opens his eyes, and it's almost like he's waking up, and he begins looking around frantically, trying to figure out what had just happened. Michael would claim he had no memory of what had just happened to him. And so at this point, Marie would tell him and Christine that she believed Michael was possessed by a demonic force, and the only thing they could do at this point would be to perform an exorcism. An exorcism is an expulsion or attempted expulsion of a supposedly evil spirit inside of a person or a place. Michael and Christine were at a loss. They had no idea what to do in this situation. They were both kind of in shock for very different reasons, and so they just kind of deferred to Marie's judgment and said, yeah, I think an exorcism is the way to go. So Christine and Michael just leave the church and go home, and then the next morning, Marie would get in touch with the Anglican Church of England and would request an exorcism. And after hearing about what was going on with Michael, the Anglican Church would say, yeah, that does sound like he needs an exorcism. And so the following day, they would send out two of their best exorcists named Peter and Raymond. And so Peter and Raymond, they get to Ossett, they go to Michael's house, and they observe him, and very quickly, they determine that it does seem like Michael is possessed by at least one demonic force. And so they tell Michael, the only thing we can do here is perform this exorcism, but we need you to agree to it. And so Michael says, okay, yeah, I agree to this exorcism, and so would his wife, because she at this point is just completely unsure what to do. She's just going along for the ride. So a day later, on October 4th at 10 p.m., Michael, his wife, and the rest of the members of this fellowship group, along with Peter and Raymond, they would all meet at this other church in a neighboring town. And as soon as Michael had been positioned in the middle of this group in this chair, Peter and Raymond began the ritual by praying. And as soon as they did, Michael began screaming out in tongues, and he began writhing around, and he fell to the ground, and he began contorting his body in grotesque positions, as if the words Peter and Raymond were saying were physically harming Michael. And so after 8 hours of this, during which they had to actually tie Michael down to prevent him from hurting other members or hurting himself, after 8 hours, they finally just came to a stop. Peter and Raymond were exhausted. It looked very much like Michael too was exhausted. And as soon as they stopped the ritual, Michael just kind of collapsed on the ground as if he had fallen unconscious. And then at some point he kind of wakes up and he's looking around wildly. He's still tied down to the ground and he's acting like he has no idea what's just happened. And at this point, Peter and Raymond, they tell him that, the exorcism was mostly successful. We identified 40 demons inside of you, and this exorcism was able to expel 37 of them. So that means there's still 3 demons inside of you. Now, we can't do it right now. We're too tired. You're too exhausted. So go home, get some rest, and tomorrow we will finish this exorcism. We will get rid of those 3 demons, and you will be just fine. And so Michael and Christine, they get their things, and they leave the church, and they head home. A few hours later, around noon, a woman who lived near where Michael Taylor and his family lived thought she heard something strange outside of her house. It sounded like someone yelling. And so she went to the front of the house and she pulled the curtain aside on one of her windows. And outside, walking down the street completely naked, covered in blood, was Michael Taylor. And he was saying something about Satan. And so this woman, she calls the police. The police show up and they find Michael. He had curled up on the sidewalk outside of this woman's house and he was giggling like a child in the fetal position. And so the police approach him, and at some point Michael apparently snaps out of it and he starts looking up at the police like he has no idea what's going on. And eventually they would get him to tell them his name and where he lived. And so after calling in backup to deal with Michael, the responding officers made their way to Michael's residence. And so they go inside, and immediately, as soon as they see what's in there, one of the officers just turns around and runs outside and begins dry heaving. The inside of the Taylor family home would become one of the most infamous crime scenes in English history. A few hours earlier, when Michael and his wife had come home from the exorcism, they had gone inside, and then Michael had fallen into one of his trances and began beating his wife. And then at some point, she fell to the ground and either was dead or was in the process of dying, at which point Michael jumped on top of her, and using only his hands, he ripped her face off and flung it across the room. And then as she's laying there bleeding to death, he began rubbing her blood all over his body. And then after she had finally died, he tracked down the family dog and killed the dog as well. Fortunately, their 5 children were not home at the time of this attack, and so they were unharmed. During Michael's trial, the prosecution and the defense blamed the Anglican Church of England and Marie and her religious group for effectively convincing Michael he was possessed with demons, which caused him to act out violently and kill his wife. And so ultimately, Michael would be found not guilty by reason of insanity, and after only 4 years of psychiatric care, he was released. And today, he is still living free in Ossett. But despite the legal outcomes of this case, there are many people, both religious and not religious, who believe the Michael Taylor case is one of the only true demonic possession cases in modern history. Also, just to close the loop, we don't know for sure if Michael and Marie were having an affair, but it is assumed they were. It begins here. From the director of It comes It, Welcome to Derry, the chilling new HBO original series exploring one of horror's biggest terrors, Pennywise the Clown. Set in 1960s Derry, Maine, the new HBO original series premieres Sunday, October 26th on HBO Max. Also, you can listen to the official It, Welcome to Derry podcast wherever you get your podcasts. In 1898, a 12-year-old boy was playing at this river that ran near his house. He was out in the forest, he was playing to this river, and he had a bow and arrow, and he was practicing shooting his bow and arrow. And after a little while, he got bored of his bow and arrow, and he went to the stream itself, and he started to build a little dam in the river to try to catch some fish. And as he's building this thing up, he's down on his knees building up this little dam in the river, he notices someone is walking down the river towards him. And he looks up, and he would describe this person as looking normal, a normal looking stranger. It's a gentleman who shows up, he's wearing a nice suit. He walks over to Wofford, and he apparently just came out of the woods. And he says, "Hey, what are you doing?" And the boy, he's like, "Oh, I'm making this fish trap." And he's like, "Man, that looks like a lot of work. Like, you should take a break." And the boy's like, "Yeah, I guess I could take a break." And the gentleman just says, "Well, if you want, while you're taking this break, you could come to my house. It's just up past the bend here. My family's there. You can have a meal with us, and then you can come back and you can finish your fish trap." And so, this is a different time. This is the late 1800s, and I'm not suggesting that at the time it was totally cool to go with strangers into weird houses in the forest, but the boy felt compelled to say yes. He didn't want to be rude, and maybe his fear of strangers is less extreme than it is, for us today in 2020. And so he agrees to go with the man. They make their way up past the river into the forest a little bit, and they come up to this cabin. Now, the boy played in the woods here, and he had never seen this house before. But he's not too concerned, because as soon as he gets to the house, this cabin in the woods, he sees that the lights are on, and he hears kids playing inside, and a close family friend of his family's is sitting on the porch talking to one of the other apparently family members of the stranger. And so the boy's put at ease, and he says hi to the family friend, and the family friend, waves back. The boy goes inside, and he sees that this family has a couple of kids, roughly his age. They're playing, goofing around. They have dinner, and this wonderful meal, and the boy, Wofford, is like, "Man, this is so great." And after the meal, he lays down and falls asleep. He kind of loses track of time. The boy falls asleep at this cabin. And so he wakes up early the next morning, and he feels horrible because he didn't mean to fall asleep, and he didn't tell anyone from his family where he was going. And he's thinking, "Man, they're going to be so worried about me." And so as he's getting up to leave, the stranger is already awake, the one that had met him down by the river and called him up to the house. And the boy says, "Hey, can you walk me down back to the river?" And the stranger's like, "I can take you part of the way down, sure." So the two of them, they're having small talk, and the boy's thanking the man for his generosity. And so as they're walking, they're passing by an orchard on one side and a cornfield on the other. And it's this beautiful morning, the sun's just coming up, and the boy remembers thinking how beautiful the setting was. But he also was thinking, like, I don't even know where I am right now. And I'm assuming he's walking me back to where I live, but this doesn't look familiar at all. And the stranger stops. They get to almost a junction right at the end of the orchard and of the cornfield. And the stranger tells the boy, Wofford, he says, "Hey, just go straight. You're gonna turn down this way, turn back, and you'll be at the river again, where we met." And the boy thanks the stranger, and the stranger turns and starts walking back towards his cabin and says, "Hey, good luck, see ya." And the boy starts following the man's directions. And Wofford, as he's walking, following the stranger's directions, he's suddenly curious and turns around to look back at this strange person who had brought him up to the house and then now brought him back. And he's stunned because suddenly the orchard and the cornfield are not there. There is no orchard or cornfield. It's just deep, dark forest. And he's like, what's going on? He turns back and there's a search party, or it looks like a search party, running up to him. Part of the search party is the family friend that he had seen at the house. And the boy's like looking at these people running towards him, like they're running to him. And he recognizes the family friend, and he can tell they're like urgently looking for him. And he felt bad because he knows he slept over through the night. So he's like, hey, I'm here. And they're like, where have you been? And the boy turns to the family friend and he's like, didn't you tell them I was with you? And the family friend is like, what are you talking about? And he's like, yeah, the house with the family. We ate dinner together last night. And the guy, the family friend, is like, I've been looking for you for the past several days. I've been with your family looking for you. You've been gone for 3 days. And the boy is like, what? And as he's describing the kind of general vicinity of where this cabin was, he's kind of pointing back up towards where it was and describing it from where the river was. The family says to him that since you've been missing, we've heard rhythmic drumming nonstop coming from the section of the forest that you just described. We can never pinpoint where it was coming from. And now that you just showed up, the drumming has stopped. And so the kid's terrified, but there's no answers. Pretty creepy. By early 1999, Christopher Case was living his best life. He was 35 years old. He had moved out to Seattle to pursue a career in music, and he had landed a job at a music company in Seattle, and he had risen to the rank of executive at that company. He was incredibly fit. He was known for being at the gym 7 days a week. He took vitamins. He took his health very seriously. He had loads of friends. People really liked him. He was very close with his family. And, despite all that, despite his popularity and success, he had been single for years. And even though he was not actively seeking a companion, his friends and family were continuously trying to set him up on dates. But Chris would prefer to not go on a date and actually stay home by himself and listen to music, because Chris had an obsession with a very specific type of music. He loved music from ancient times, specifically from Egypt. And so he would stay home instead of go out on dates and, crush ancient Egyptian music. That was like his idea of a great night. On April 11th of 1999, Chris was on a business trip because part of his job required a ton of travel. And he was on a trip with a couple of his coworkers, who were also friends of his. They go out to San Francisco, and on the 11th, they decide to go out for dinner that night. And one of his co-workers decides to bring along a friend who was someone that lived in the area. So they get to dinner, and one of them has their friend, who's an older woman, very attractive, very kind of intense looking woman. She was about 20 years older than Chris, that was his guess. And she sits down, and the four of them are just kind of having a nice conversation. And at some point, the older woman really takes an interest in Chris. And Chris takes an interest in her because it would turn out that they had a lot in common. And then she actually admitted to him that she was really into music from ancient times and actually has a specific interest in music from ancient Egypt. And so to Chris, he's like, how can this be? And he's like, this is my passion. I love that type of music. And they really hit it off. Now, Chris was not looking for any sort of romantic involvement with this woman. He was just so excited to talk about something he loved. And so all night, Chris and this older woman are chatting it up, and they're super into each other. He was looking at her purely from a platonic sense, but it was becoming clear by the end of the night, at least Chris was realizing this, that she was looking at him with a romantic angle. She was interested in Chris. And in fact, right as he's kind of realizing this, she asks him if he wants to leave with her and go back to her place. And he politely declines because he's not interested. He loved chatting with her about music and other things they had in common, but he wasn't interested in her romantically. And she became a little bit more aggressive and said, no, come on, let's get out of here. I got a place right down the road. We can go listen to music and hang out in my place. And he felt really uncomfortable and he kept saying no, but she wouldn't let it go. And so finally, as she's literally trying to get him to say yes, he says, hey, you know what? I've had a long night. I'm going to go. And so he stands up to leave, and the woman goes from being very flirtatious and friendly to very angry at Chris. And she looks at him and kind of abruptly says to him,
I'm actually a witch, and I'm going to put a curse on you. You're going to be dead within a week.
Okay. And he just leaves. So the next morning on April 12th, Chris gets up and he heads to the airport and he flies back to Seattle. When he lands in Seattle, he calls his friend Sammy, who was one of his very close friends back when he lived on the East Coast. He just wanted to share this weird experience with a close friend. And so they're kind of laughing about the whole thing. Neither of them are taking the curse seriously at all. It was like, you really dodged a bullet. It's good you did not go home with her. So in good spirits, Chris hangs up the phone with Sammy, and for the next 24 hours, Chris would fall right back into his regular daily life in Seattle. Nothing out of the ordinary happened. But all that would change starting the night of April 13th, which would have been 48 hours after his encounter with this woman in San Francisco. So Chris lives alone. He doesn't have pets. And he gets into bed that night and he's laying there, and before he falls asleep, he hears whispering coming from outside of his bedroom in the kitchen area, kind of near the front door. And he's thinking to himself, like, I didn't just hear whispering. Like, what? No one's in here. What's going on? And he's hearing the whispering, and then it kind of stops. And before he gets up to investigate, he's like, okay, I probably was just hearing things. That wasn't real. And he's just kind of laying there trying to go to sleep, and then he hears it again. Except now it's not coming from the kitchen area. It's coming from a separate area in his apartment outside of the room he's in. And so now he's wondering, like, did someone sneak into my house? Like, is there a burglar in my house right now? And so he quietly gets out of his bed and he walks over to his door, he opens it up, and he can still hear the whispering, and it's coming from like his laundry room a little ways away. But as soon as he opens the door and he pokes his head out, the whispering stops. And he's just standing there, like, looking around, like hoping that there isn't anything in his apartment. And then out of the corner of his eye, near the front door, he sees something dash across his periphery. Like a shadowy figure basically darts across the room. And so he looks over and he's immediately afraid that it really is a burglar in his room. And as he's looking, he's turning the light on next to him, he's looking around, and he starts hearing the whispering again, and now it's coming from another section of his house. So he just starts turning on all the lights and looking around to try to, like, make sure no one's in his apartment. He's not even thinking about the whispering. He's just looking for this shadowy figure that he saw run past him. And so he's looking all over his apartment. All the lights are on. It's a small apartment. And as soon as he feels comfortable that the door's locked still, everything's locked, and there's nobody here, that's when he realizes that whispering is still happening. And so he turns back around, and now the whispering's coming from his bedroom where he was. And so he walks over to his bedroom and looks inside, and he can't pinpoint the whispering. Like, he keeps hearing it and walking to wherever it's coming from, and as soon as he gets near it, the whispering stops. And he's thinking to himself, like, am I dreaming? Is this a dream? Am I losing my mind? Did somebody slip me something, like, last night? Like, what's wrong with me? So he has this horrible night where he's up all night chasing down whispers in his apartment that keep vanishing, and then seeing shadowy figures running around and lurking in corners, but he can't ever see them when he looks at them. And so the next morning on April 14th, when the sun comes up, he hasn't slept, the first phone call he makes is to Sammy, his friend. And he's totally panicked, and we know about this phone call because Sammy would tell police about all her interactions with Chris over the course of this week. She would say that he was totally panicked. And she even thought, as she's taking this phone call, that it's just so weird, that Chris is scared of noises in his apartment and, like, figures moving around in his apartment, because it's so unlike Chris. He's, definitely a skeptic. He's just like he's a no BS kind of guy. So the idea that he would suddenly be terrified of something paranormal running around his apartment just seems so unlike him. But as she's listening to him, he was so scared about what was in his apartment. He knew it wasn't a person because he looked everywhere. There was no people. And that's the only reason he didn't call the police, is because he didn't want to tell the police that some shadow figure that's whispering in my apartment is harassing me. Like, what are the police gonna do? So Sammy hangs up the phone with Chris after trying to reassure him and just hopes that whatever that was doesn't happen again. But unfortunately for Chris, the night of the 14th now, he's going to bed again and he starts hearing the whispers, and immediately he's out there looking, lights on. He's looking for these whispers. They keep disappearing. He can't find the source. He's getting frustrated. He's scared. He keeps seeing that thing dart around his apartment. Except this night, he also noticed that he would look and he could get close enough to where he could break out the silhouette of what looked like a person, you know, like lingering in the corner of his apartment, but he'd go closer to it and it would disappear. It was like the manifestations of what he was seeing, the whispers and this figure running around his apartment, were becoming more vivid. But he's also thinking, like, I didn't sleep the night before. This could be my imagination. Like, I don't know if this is happening, but he's spiraling and he knows it. So the next day on the 15th, he doesn't call Sammy, but he calls a couple of his other friends that are anonymous, and they would all tell police that they got a similar story that Sammy had gotten that first night after the 14th. No matter what was happening, Chris believed it was happening, and Chris was terrified. But this wasn't even the worst of it yet. So that night on the 15th, Chris gets in bed, and now he's barely slept for 2 consecutive nights, and he's determined to just go to sleep. That he's trying to tell himself that everything that you've experienced the past couple nights is probably brought on by stress. It's brought on by now certainly a lack of sleep. So he's telling himself, like, just go to sleep. Just get in bed and go to sleep. So he gets in bed and he's laying there and he does fall asleep. But he wakes up in the middle of the night and he can't move his body. He's paralyzed. He can't move, and he's totally awake. And he starts hearing whispering. And now his level of fear is so high because now he's immobile. But the past 2 nights he's heard that whispering in his apartment, and he's seen that figure moving around his apartment. And so he's laying there in darkness because he went to bed in darkness. And he starts hearing whispering outside his room, and then it stops. And then he starts hearing whispering inside of his closet, and then it stops. And then he hears whispering right underneath his bed, and he can't move. And he's just laying there praying that nothing horrible is going to happen to him, that this is just a dream. And then out from underneath his bed, right next to him, he can only turn his eyes. This black figure, this shadowy black figure emerges right next to his bed. And it's looking down at him. He can't make out any facial expressions, but he can clearly define, a figure is hovering over him. And it reaches down and puts its hands around his neck and begins to throttle him. And Chris is like gagging. He can't breathe, but he can't move. And at some point, the thing begins to lift him off of his bed by his neck and then throws him back down. And then the figure vanishes. Chris still couldn't move. He's choking to breathe, but he can't move. And he's just waiting for this thing to come back. And he knows that more than likely, whatever this is probably going to kill him this night. So he's laying there just thinking, oh my God, I'm about to die. I'm about to die. But the thing doesn't come back, and Chris can't move. And at some point, Chris, probably out of just pure, adrenaline crash or something, he falls asleep. And so when Chris wakes up and he can move again, he notices there's blood inside of his bed on his sheets. And then he looks at his hands, and at the tips of all 10 fingers are these incisions, like someone had intentionally cut open the top of every finger, something he certainly didn't do. And his bed is covered in blood from these 10 cuts on his hands. And then he feels his neck, and it feels tender. And it turns out he had marks in his neck. It was all bruised up from this thing choking him out. And it brought him back to, like, that really happened. He's now, like, actually in fear for his life. Chris immediately calls Sammy and tells Sammy everything that happened. And Sammy can't believe any of it. She felt helpless because she's on the other side of the country. She can't help him. And Chris is just petrified, and he's like, he can barely speak, he's like unable to articulate what's happening. He's describing these cuts on his hand and his neck, but there's no one in his apartment. And Sammy's trying to get him to call the police, but Chris is like, I can't call the police. What am I gonna tell him? That a shadowy figure is coming in my apartment and choking me? They're gonna think I'm crazy. Chris decides he's gonna approach this head on. Maybe that woman in San Francisco did put some curse on me. I need to go at least research it. And so there was a religious bookstore right near his house that he figured might have some things on demonic possession and demons, the occult. And he goes in there and he kind of awkwardly approaches the store owner and is like, I'm looking for books about demons and witchcraft and like how to protect yourself against that. And the guy points him towards a section of the store. And so Chris goes over there, he scoops up a whole bunch of books. He also buys like a whole bundle of crucifixes. So like at least 10. So he's got all these crucifixes, he's got all these books about demonic possession and witchcraft. He buys all of that and he leaves and he goes back to his apartment. When he gets back, after doing some research, he ends up putting these crucifixes all over his apartment, like every room. And he takes salt and he draws a line all through his apartment against the baseboard of every wall in the house. And at every corner of the house, he'd pile up little piles of salt. He was going to do all the things that people say to do if you're dealing with demons or ghosts or anything through witchcraft. He was kind of grasping at straws a little bit. So he went out and did everything he thought he could possibly do to protect himself. That night, which was April 16th, we don't know what happened to Chris, but something scared him so badly that in the middle of the night, in a full panic, he runs out of his apartment and he checks into a hotel and does not stay at his apartment. The next morning, April 17th, when Sammy called Chris to check on him. Now remember, this is 1999. There was just landline phones. So she calls his landline at his apartment to check on him. There's no answer because he's not there. He's at the hotel. And Sammy, who's been speaking to Chris and other friends that have been speaking to Chris, and everyone's concerned about his mental health and what's going on with him, when she doesn't get Chris to pick up his phone, she calls the police and she says, "Hey, I'm concerned about my friend. Can you do a welfare check on this guy?" And they go over to his apartment and it's locked. And they kind of look in the windows and everything just seems kind of quiet. And so they leave and they tell Sammy like, "Hey, look, it's locked. We can't really do anything. Let us know if you don't hear from him in the next couple of days." And so that was it. And so Sammy's like super concerned. And so she goes to work on the 17th. And then when she gets back, she has a voicemail from Chris, who had called her at some point during the day while she was out. And on the voicemail, Chris tells her in a voice that was different than the past few days. The past few days, he was scared. He was really scared. This time, he is defeated. He was like resigned to whatever was going on. And he says to Sammy on the voicemail, he's under attack. And that tonight, they're gonna kill me. And there's nothing I can do. As soon as she's done listening to the message, Sammy calls Chris, but she can't get in touch with him. She knows she just talked to the police who were there at his apartment that day. They're probably just going to tell her like, "Hey, wait until tomorrow. We just told you, earlier, just give it a couple days." And so she just decides that she's going to go to bed and she's going to try calling him again on April 18th. On the morning of April 18th, Chris didn't show up for work. And word got back to Sammy, who was already going to reach out to Chris that morning anyways. But, the friends and family are talking about what's going on with Chris. And so word got back to her that Chris had missed work. And so she calls Chris. He's not picking up from his landline. And now she calls the police back and she says, "Hey, you were there yesterday. I know it was locked, but he hasn't shown up for work today. Everybody's concerned about him. Can you please go over and check?" And so the police go back over to Chris's apartment. And this time, the front door is unlocked. And they go inside and they're met with this very strange scene. You have all these crucifixes that are on the wall. You have the salt that lines every room in the house. There are all these candles that have burned down to the wick. There are little scraps of paper all over the apartment that were handwritten, little messages that Chris was leaving all over the house, warding off spirits and demons. I mean, it just looked like out of a Hollywood set for some demonic movie or something. And they search the house and there's no sign of Chris. They're yelling for him. There's no sign of him. And they make their way into the bathroom where they discover Chris's body. Chris was in his bathtub, no water in the bathtub. He's fully clothed. There's all these candles all around the outside of this bathtub. There's, more crucifixes and weird relics that are in the bathroom with him. And he's on his knees and he's slouched up against the wall with his hands kind of tucked against his chest. He had no external injuries. He was just dead. And so the police take Chris's body and the coroner comes in and does a report, and it comes out that Chris died of natural causes. He died of a heart attack. And so when friends and family saw that that was his cause of death, they didn't buy it. They were like, "I don't know how to describe what happened to him." But over the past 7 days, Chris went from this happy, healthy, successful guy to a complete raving paranoid lunatic. And no one knows why. It's certainly possible that it was just a very poorly timed heart attack, mixed in with someone having a psychotic break. Or some people say that he really was cursed by that woman in San Francisco, and that was the result. She said, "You're going to die within the week," and he literally died within the week. And he described regularly over the phone to his friends and family, as this was happening, these horrible experiences at night with these shadow beings in his room and it attacking him. It's just this crazy story that to this day leaves friends, family, and investigators baffled. On February 17th, 2004, shoppers inside of a massive Japanese superstore called Jusco in Wakachi City were suddenly aware of a loud commotion. When they went to investigate, they found a thin young woman with a young baby strapped to her chest, grappling with an older man. Initially, onlookers didn't know what to do. They stood there shocked at what they were seeing. Then the woman yelled out, "Thief!" The man she was fighting with was in his late 60s, and he had pinned the woman and her baby up against this bank of ATMs, and his fists were clenched like he was holding whatever it was he took from her. 3 men from the crowd immediately jumped into action and wrestled the man off of the woman and pinned him to the ground and began trying to pull his hands open to take out whatever he had stolen from this woman, but the man would not unclench his fists. And so these 3 men yelled out to the police that happened to be nearby. They ran over and jumped on top of this guy and handcuffed him. And the man, as he's laying on the ground, is yelling out that he did nothing wrong. And then onlookers would say he began moaning very strangely before he began violently vomiting before falling unconscious. While the police waited for emergency services to show up and take this man to the hospital, they were able to open up his fists and discovered the only thing he was clutching was his own bank card that was now bent in 3 places. The wallet he had on him belonged to him, and the bags that were lying on the ground all around him only contained some pet supplies that he had recently purchased. It did not appear he had actually taken anything from this woman. And speaking of this woman, the police were so caught up in the chaos of the moment that they hadn't even thought to look around for the victim to see if she was okay. So they poked their heads up and start looking around the crowd for this woman, but she's nowhere to be seen. And so they asked the crowd, do we know who she is or where she went? And nobody knew. The police did think it was odd that this woman had walked off without talking to them first, but they figured if she walked away, then everything must be fine. And so they labeled the incident an attempted robbery, and they closed the case. The following day, the older man, who became known as Mr. A by police, died at the hospital as a result of heart failure caused by extreme stress. When the police found out about this, they simply went into the case file, updated it to show the suspect had died, and did not investigate further. But Mr. A's family refused to believe he had just attacked a young woman and her baby. It was completely out of character. He was a gentle retiree who had spent 40 years working for a chemical manufacturer and now was collecting a pension and working part-time as a security guard. He lived with his wife, his children, and his grandchildren, and he lived about a kilometer away from the Jusco, where he had gone that day to get some hamster food for his grandson's hamster. His family pleaded with police to reopen the case and investigate this woman because she must have done something to start this altercation. The police initially resisted, but ultimately conceded and said, okay, we'll check the CCTV camera footage at the Jusco to make sure we didn't miss anything. And what they discovered terrified them. A camera overlooking the ATM bank where this whole scuffle went down picked up this woman about 5 minutes before Mr. A walked into frame. She was standing in a corner just off to the side of the ATMs, and she did appear to have a 2-year-old or 1-year-old strapped to her chest, and she was just standing there motionless with her back to the corner looking down. And then when Mr. A came into frame, he appeared to pull some money out of the ATM. He had bags all over his arms. He turned around after getting his cash and started walking away. And as soon as he does, the woman in the corner suddenly becomes animated. She lifts her head up and walks straight past him, skimming his chest with her hand as she passed. And right after she did that, it was like Mr. A had a reaction to being touched by her, and he instinctively grabbed her arm, and that's when the struggle ensued, and that's when the woman yelled out "thief," although it's clear from the footage that she is the aggressor, not Mr. A. And then at some point, the 3 men jump out of the crowd, they pull him to the ground, the police show up, and then at some point during this chaotic melee, the woman just stands up and meanders her way into the crowd and disappears. Although the police searched every piece of footage in and around this ATM all around the time of the incident, they never found any footage of this woman entering or exiting the Jusco. It was like she just appeared in that corner in order to go after Mr. A and then vanished as soon as it was done. And none of the dozens of witnesses that watched the scuffle take place right in front of them in broad daylight were able to provide any sort of meaningful description of this woman. It was like nobody got a really good look at her. But after reviewing hours and hours of the CCTV footage, the police did find one instance where this woman, for 1 second, looked up at a camera exposing her face. And her face was so unsettling to police that they actually decided not to share the image with the public for an entire year. They were scared that if people saw this image, it would scare them from ever going back to Jusco. This is the image of the woman. As you can see, her face is totally emotionless, her eyes are blank and downcast. Some have compared her face to a death mask, which is a plaster cast of a dead person's face. Other people have said she doesn't even look human. After seeing the CCTV footage, Mr. A's relatives sued the police for detaining him and pinning him to the ground despite his obvious medical distress as a result of whatever this woman did to him. Eventually, they did reach a settlement, but what they really wanted was an explanation for who this woman was. But even after the police released this strange photo to the public, nobody ever came forward, so she was never identified. And it's unlikely she'll ever be identified because the statute of limitations for this case expired in 2011. The case, which is now referred to as the Jusco Phantom, is still very famous in Japan, and it remains a popular topic on long internet chat room threads where people exchange this eerie photograph and speculate about who or what killed Mr. A. In 2007, 35-year-old Eva Wisniewska was a member of the German national paragliding team. Over the previous 2 years, Eva had competed in 10 of the world's biggest paragliding competitions, and she had won 6 of them, making her the top female paraglider in the world. So coming into that year, Eva was very motivated to work extra hard to make sure she retained that title as world champion. On February 24th of that year, Eva was preparing her gear alongside 200 other paragliders on Mount Bora in New South Wales, Australia. This was Eva's last training opportunity before her first major competition of that year, which was scheduled for the next week. As they were getting ready to launch, one of the coaches walked in front of the group and made an announcement. He said storm clouds had been spotted to the north, but the forecast was a little bit ambiguous. It wasn't clear if the storm was going to move over their training area or not. So it was up to each of the paragliders if they still wanted to launch that day and risk the bad weather. Eva, who was really eager to get this training flight in, looked at the sky and saw that it was pretty gray, but decided that she was going to do it. Worst case scenario, she would have to cut it short. The rest of the German national team, they didn't want to take the risk, and so they stayed grounded that day. Eva took a little bit longer preparing her gear, so by the time she was lining up on the cliff, she was only one of a handful of people that remained. And so strapped into her glider, she took a good run forward and launched herself up into the air. On the ground, the rest of the German national team followed in a van to track her progress and checked in with her from time to time with their radio. The first part of Eva's journey was incredibly calm. She followed the ridgeline from Mount Bora for 12 miles until it ended. At that point, she entered into the skies over the vast savanna. As her GPS and tracking log ticked, tracking her progress, 2 large thunderstorm clouds appeared in front of her, one larger than the other. The vast majority of the other paragliders that had launched that day had launched ahead of Eva, and so when these clouds appeared, they had already passed that section, and so they didn't need to contend with the storm. As for Eva and the other 2 people she was with, which was an Austrian team member and a Chinese team member, they had a decision to make. They could either immediately ground their flight to avoid the storm, or they could attempt to dodge it. They chose the latter. They knew it was too dangerous to try to fly underneath these clouds because of something called updraft. At the beginning of storms, warm air is sucked up from the ground up into these clouds, and a paraglider, if they get caught in that, can get sucked up with the air into the storm. And so Eva and the other 2 paragliders began aggressively flying around the outside of these clouds when all of a sudden the storm completely changed. The big cloud overtook the small cloud, creating this 12-mile wide cumulonimbus cloud that now all 3 paragliders were stuck inside of. Any updraft is dangerous to a paraglider, But the updraft of a cumulonimbus cloud is famously dangerous because it's extremely powerful and it lasts for over an hour. The Austrian man was able to pull down on one toggle, point his feet, and begin spiraling all the way out of the grasp of this updraft. And he said he turned to look at the other two, and he didn't see the Chinese man, but he did see Ava, and she was desperately trying to do what he was doing and spiral down, but she was clearly caught in the updraft, and he watched her get pulled up into the black cloud out of view. By the time the Austrian man hit the ground, he would say it had become the worst thunderstorm he had ever seen, with huge hail balls hitting the ground all around him. He took one more look up and he didn't see the Chinese man, he didn't see Ava anywhere, and he took off running for a barn to seek shelter. And when he was there, he pulled out his radio and he alerted the other teams of this emergency. Inside the cloud, Ava was hurtling up like a rocket. The storm was lifting her at a rate of 60 feet per second. There was nothing she could do to get out of this wind tunnel. Ava knew she was getting pulled towards the storm's eye in its vicious center because of the immense claps of thunder that just kept getting louder and louder, and it also kept getting darker and darker all around her. In fact, it was pitch black except for the occasional flash of lightning that came very close to electrocuting her. As she desperately tried to keep her glider stable, she was able to place a radio call down to her team on the ground, but all she could say was, "I can't see anything," before it cut out. And at some point, Ava reached the eye of the storm where it's pitch black and the temperatures are freezing and hail balls the size of oranges are pelting her left and right. And the updraft kept pulling her higher and higher and higher until she passed out from a lack of oxygen. And at some point, this updraft actually shot her up and out of the cloud. And while this meant she was out of the storm, she was now in air that was 50 degrees below zero, which meant everything, her face, her gloves, her clothes, the wings of her glider, everything completely froze. And to make matters worse, at the altitude she was at, there was almost no oxygen and she did not have a breathing apparatus. So by all accounts, Ava should be dead. But somehow, she didn't die. She just kept floating around above this storm cloud for 45 minutes. And then something happened. The ice on one side of the glider broke off, causing it to collapse, throwing her into a deadly free fall, and she's not in control, she's still unconscious, and she starts barreling back towards the ground like gravity has been turned back on again, going straight through the storm all over again. And so through the storm, going at 90 feet per second, she clears the storm, and then right after getting out from underneath it, her glider miraculously just opens back up again. And the jerking motion of her suddenly stopping her free fall jolted her awake. And so she's looking around, totally confused as she's gradually regaining consciousness, and she's taking stock of where she is, and she's still in the storm cloud, but right at the bottom of it. But luckily, the updraft had stopped. And so she was steady, and she was able to reach up and grab her toggles, and she was able to fly herself down to the ground and crash land, and then she curled into a ball, grabbed her radio, and she called her team. When they heard her voice, they could not believe she was alive, because the other paraglider that got sucked up by the updraft, the guy from the Chinese national team, he unfortunately was struck by lightning and was killed. And so they were anticipating finding out that Ava had been struck by lightning as well. But Ava had not just survived. When they brought her to the hospital, they discovered that virtually nothing was wrong with her. She had some pretty bad bruises and cuts from the hail, and she had a little bit of frostbite on her face, but it was treatable. And so the same day she was brought in, they discharged her. After leaving the hospital, she and her teammates went back to the launch site so she could collect her gear. And when they got there, she looked at her GPS, and the GPS had been tracking her entire flight the entire time she was up in that cloud. And she showed her teammates what it said, and they literally couldn't believe it. The screen showed she had reached an altitude of 32,634 feet, which, to put this in perspective, is the same altitude you fly at inside of a commercial jet. So imagine being outside of your plane in the middle of a flight, and that's how high she was. Another reference point is she was approximately 4,000 feet higher than the summit of Mount Everest. No human being had ever been that high, unprotected, and lived to tell the tale. Until Ava. In the early morning hours of June 10th, 1994, Deborah Hoyt suddenly woke up in the middle of the night. She and her husband were staying with relatives in Sacramento, California, and they were supposed to be there for the next couple of days. But as she was sitting there, she had this overwhelming urge to want to leave right then and there and head back to their home in Lake Tahoe. Because she didn't really know what to make of this overwhelming feeling, she shook her husband awake and told him about it. She thought that maybe something was wrong, and he said, "You know what, you probably just had a bad dream and you're kind of waking up still half in your dream. It's not a big deal. Just go back to bed. I'm sure everything is totally fine. And in the morning, if you still want to, I'd be happy to leave. And so Deborah said, yeah, you're right. I'm totally overreacting. I'm sure it was just a dream. And she laid back down to try to go back to sleep. But as she laid there, that sense of dread that something was wrong and that she had to leave right now, it was just growing and growing and growing until she just jumped out of the bed and she's just standing in the room and she says to her husband, honey, we gotta go right now. I don't know what's wrong, but we gotta go right now. And her husband did not want to go. And he said, come on, Deborah, get back in bed. It's not a big deal. But she was adamant. She said, get out of bed. We're leaving right now. And so begrudgingly, her husband said, okay, we'll leave right now. And so the two of them hastily packed up and then went downstairs and left a note for their relatives explaining their absence, and then they got in their car and they drove off. After a little while, the couple reached a very dangerous section of their journey back home. It was called Bullion Bend, and it was a very windy road up in the mountains where one wrong turn and you're going flying down the side of a mountain. After driving through this area for about 15 minutes, they rounded a particularly sharp turn, and as soon as they made the turn and could look down the road, Deborah, who was in the passenger seat, she saw up ahead on the right, off the side of the road several feet, something that was just lying there on the side of the road. She didn't know what it was. She thought it was maybe a bag or some trash or maybe a dead animal, and at first she was just going to dismiss it. But as her husband drove closer and closer to it, the light began to illuminate it, and she looked at it and couldn't really discern what it was until they were right next to it, and she looked out her window and she noticed it was a woman's body, a woman who had no clothes on, who was just lying there totally motionless. And Deborah immediately turns to her husband and says, honey, I just saw a dead woman on the side of the road. And her husband immediately is kind of panicked and doesn't slow down. He just keeps driving and says, hey, should we stop? Should we turn around? I mean, maybe she's not dead. Maybe we can help her. But Deborah at this point is now terrified and she's saying, no, keep going. Don't go back. I bet it's a trap. Someone probably put her there and they're going to lure us in and they're going to attack us if we try to stop and help her. And so in this kind of chaotic, frenzied reaction that Deborah and her husband are having, they decide that their best course of action is just to drive on and find the next payphone and call the police. And it just so happened that less than a quarter of a mile away was a ranger station with a phone. And so they pull into the parking lot and Deborah calls the police. The police tell her to wait inside of her car and they'll be out in a couple of minutes and they're going to need her to bring them up to where she saw this body. So a couple of minutes goes by, the police show up, and they tell them to drive back up the road, but stop about 200 yards short of where you believe this woman's body is. And so Deborah and her husband, they get back in the car, they drive back up the road where they came from, and right at this point where the road turned very sharply is where Deborah knew on the other side of this turn would be this body. And so they pulled over on the side of the road, the police came up on their side, and they said, yep, right around the corner, you're gonna find her lying on the ground on the left side. And so Deborah and her husband are just sitting in the car watching as the police go up, they make that turn, and they kind of disappear out of sight, and then they see their spotlight moving around on the other side of this turn, and so they figure, okay, they're looking for the body. But after several minutes, the police came back down the road, and they stopped next to Deborah's car, and they said, you know what, guys? We didn't see anything up there. There wasn't a body. There wasn't anything out of the ordinary. And Deborah would say to police, I'm not lying. I know what I saw. It was a woman's body right there in front of me. I know it. It's right over there. And they would tell her that we believe you, but we can't do anything because there's nothing up there. And so they told Deborah and her husband to just head home, and they did. After Deborah and her husband took off and were gone, the two responding officers drove back to their police station, and once they were inside, they began speculating about what Deborah might have seen. And as they were talking, another officer came into the station, a guy by the name of Rich Strasser, and he overhears them, and he goes over, he's intrigued, and he asked them, what happened? What did you see? And they explained to him that this woman, Deborah, had spotted a supposed dead woman's body up on Bullion Bend. And as soon as he heard Bullion Bend, Rich remembered that just a couple of days ago, they had received a missing person report of a young woman named Christine Skubish and her young son named Nick, who had gone missing, and the last place they had been seen was up on Bullion Bend. And so Rich wondered if maybe there was a body up there, and maybe it was Christine's. And so the next morning, Rich got up early and he headed out to Bullion Bend, and when he reached the exact spot where Deborah had claimed to have seen this dead woman's body, he found a children's shoe. And so he stopped his car, he got out, he picked the shoe up, and he's looking around and he's looking for anything else that's out of the ordinary, but there's nothing on the road, there's no skid marks, there's no other debris, there's no other clothes, there's nothing. And so he walks over to the guardrail that overlooks this very steep embankment, and he looks down the other side, and at first all he sees is just trees everywhere, but as he's looking, he thinks he sees more clothing farther down the mountain. And so he climbs over the guardrail and he very carefully maneuvers his way down. And after only a couple of seconds, he reaches a clearing in the branches and the trees, and he can see down to where the train kind of levels off. And right down there is a smashed up red 4-door sedan. It was the same type of car that Christine Skubish had been driving when she went missing. And so Rich ran down the mountain, following debris all the way to this wrecked car. He goes around to the driver's side and he looks inside, and there in the driver's seat is Christine Skubish, and unfortunately she was deceased. And then on the passenger seat is her son, Nicky, and he is alive, but barely. He had gone 5 days without food or water. And doctors would say when Rich found him, he probably only had about 1, maybe 2 hours before he would have died as well. Authorities believe Christine fell asleep at the wheel and she drove off that embankment. Initially, Rich believed Deborah must have seen Christine when she was driving through the mountains and saw that woman on the side of the road. After her accident, Christine must have gotten out of her car and then climbed up that embankment and then laid on the road, hoping someone would see her. And then when no one stopped for her, she went back down to her car where she ultimately died. But according to the coroner, that would have been impossible because when Christine crashed off the road, she died on impact 5 days before Deborah saw that woman on the side of the road. So it could not have been Christine. To this day, no one knows for sure who or what Deborah saw on the side of the road. But it is objectively true that Rich only investigated Bullion Bend and found Nicky alive because of Deborah's police report about this dead woman on the side of the road. And Deborah was only on that road because she'd had this totally weird middle of the night urge to suddenly leave a relative's house and drive up into the mountains, something she had never felt before and didn't really know how to explain. So either this is an extremely strange set of circumstances, or Nicky had a guardian angel.
As many of you may know, aside from telling stories on this YouTube channel, I also tell stories on my podcast, the MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories. But that's not all. In addition to that podcast, under the Ballen Studios umbrella, there is a whole host of other podcasts that you can binge right now, and their content, all of them, fall into the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious category. For example, if you're into baffling and horrifying medical mysteries, well, you should go check out my other podcast called MrBallen's Medical Mysteries. Or maybe you want to hear from some other voices within our studio, like Luke LaManna. Luke LaManna is a military veteran. He has a super iconic, really deep radio voice, and he has 2 shows. One is called Wartime Stories, where he basically looks at strange, dark, and mysterious wartime stories, and his other show is called Redacted, where he looks at information that used to be classified, and he dives into it with his military expertise and experience, and he basically shows you the lies and secrets and half-truths that the most powerful institutions in the world have been keeping from us. We also have shows that are just plain creepy and unsettling, like Bedtime Stories, hosted by Richard Weil, where he dives into the supernatural and cryptids and mysterious deaths. I mean, basically his whole kind of niche is things that keep you up at night. And then 2 other shows that fall into that sort of unsettling, creepy vibe are Late Nights with Nexpo, hosted by the famous YouTuber Nexpo, where he dives into true, crazy, scary stories. And then we also have another show called Run Fool, hosted by Rodney Barnes. And Rodney is like an icon in the horror genre at large. And on his show, he just dives into this wild, chilling lore, like horror lore. People love that show. Or if you're a history buff, you need to check out our new hit show called A Twist of History. It's hosted by Joel, who also has an amazing YouTube channel. It's called Let's Read. And on A Twist of History, he dives into epic stories that have shaped the world that we live in now. So if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, go check out these shows. You can look for them either by name or simply by looking for Ballen Studios on any podcast platform. They are available right now. Enjoy.
In 1980, Bobby Shafran was on his way up to Sullivan County Community College, which is 2 hours outside of New York City, to begin his freshman year. Even though he was from the area, he didn't know anybody that was going to this particular school, and so he was pretty nervous about it. Plus, he wasn't that popular in high school, and he had a hard time making friends. When he pulled into a parking spot at the school, he saw a sea of people getting out of their parents' cars and carrying boxes up to their dorm rooms. And so he took a deep breath, hopped out of his car, grabbed his backpack, and began walking across the lawn towards the dorm building. On his walk over, Bobby was surprised when he felt like all these random strangers on the lawn were looking at him like they knew him. And a couple people yelled out to him and said, "Hey, it's good to have you back here." And one girl actually ran up to him and kissed him on the cheek and said, "Oh my gosh, I'm so happy you're back." And Bobby said, "I think you got the wrong person. I don't know you." And she laughed and she just ran away. And so Bobby's totally bewildered by this because he doesn't know anybody, but everybody seems to know him. And so he walks up the steps and he goes inside the dorm building. And as he's walking down the hall, people are high-fiving him and patting him on the back. And then right as he's about to turn the corner towards his actual dorm room, someone down the hall behind him yells out, "Hey, Eddie, what's going on, man?" And Bobby knew whoever it was yelling at him. Because this whole situation had been so weird, he felt like this had to be a case of mistaken identity. And so Bobby turned around and he saw at the other end of the hall another student who he didn't know, clearly waving at him and yelling out, "Hey, Eddie, come here, what's going on, man?" And so Bobby walks up to him and says, "Hey, I'm not Eddie. I don't know what's going on, but everybody thinks I'm somebody that I'm not, but I'm not Eddie. Who's Eddie?" And the guy said, "Yeah, okay, Eddie, it's good to have you back here, man," and then walked off. And so Bobby's like, what is going on here? And so Bobby turns and he goes back up to his dorm room and he goes inside and he just shuts the door and he's thinking, I just want to be left alone for a second because this is not right. This is not how a freshman who doesn't know anyone gets welcomed at any school or any place in the world. This is totally unusual. And just a couple of minutes after being inside of his dorm room, he hears a knock on the door and Bobby's like, oh great, who is it now? Who is it that thinks I'm someone I'm not? So he opens the door and there's another student who he doesn't know who's standing there, and this guy, his face just drains of color and he starts shaking when he sees Bobby. And they're both looking at each other like, what's going on here? And the student says to Bobby, "Were you adopted?" And Bobby said, "Yeah." And then the student said, "Is your birthday July 12th? And Bobby said, "Yeah." And so the student goes, "Okay, my name is Michael and I am best friends with a guy named Eddie Galland, and you are his clone. You have got to be his identical twin." At this point, to Bobby, this almost made sense, but it was so crazy to imagine having some identical twin he didn't know about. And so Bobby asked Michael if he could go meet Eddie because he's got to be a student here. And Michael said, well, actually, Eddie decided not to come back to school this year, which is probably why everyone you talked to was so excited to see you because they love Eddie and they thought you were him, and so they're psyched to have you back. After talking for a couple of minutes, Michael tells Bobby that they have to go call Eddie and they have to set up a meeting so that Bobby can meet Eddie and vice versa. And so Michael and Bobby run outside to a payphone booth, they hop inside, they're crammed in there, and they dial up Eddie. And as soon as Eddie answers, Bobby grabs the phone and just says, "Hey Eddie, my name's Bobby and everybody thinks I'm you." And then Eddie says, "Yeah, I've been getting a lot of calls about that too." And Bobby would later say that when he first heard Eddie's voice, he said it sounded like his own voice coming through the phone. And so ultimately, Eddie invited Bobby and Michael to come to his house so that Eddie and Bobby could see if it really was true that they were twins. And so Michael and Bobby hopped in Bobby's car and they sped 2 hours to Eddie's house. And when they got there, it was the middle of the night, and Eddie's house is the only house in this quiet suburb that has all the lights on. And so Michael and Bobby walk up the path towards the front door of Eddie's house, and right as Bobby is about to knock on the door, it flies open, and standing in front of Bobby is his exact clone. It's Eddie. And Eddie's looking back at Bobby and he can't believe what he's looking at. They are definitely identical twins, and they both immediately saw that. Michael would say after Bobby and Eddie just stared at each other for about a minute, they just started laughing. It was like they were total strangers, but at the same time, they had this connection immediately. They knew they were related and they were laughing and they hugged and they just stared at each other. And Michael said anytime Bobby would tilt his head, Eddie would mimic it, and vice versa. It was like they were looking into a mirror. Shortly after, this story of these two long-lost brothers reconnecting found its way to Newsday, which was a prominent local newspaper in New York, and they decided they would look into it to see if it was really true or not. And so one of the editors had a junior reporter fly out and actually see Bobby and Eddie face to face and see if it was really true that they were in fact identical twins. And as soon as this reporter saw them, they knew immediately that, yep, they're related. And so Newsday printed this totally heartwarming fairy tale story about these two long-lost brothers reconnected after all these years just because of a chance encounter in college. And everybody loved it. But this is where the story went from amazing to truly unbelievable. Friends of another young man living in the New York area named David Kelman began telling David that he had to check out this Newsday article about these long-lost twins because these two twins look exactly like David. Specifically, they said you gotta look at these guys' hands. They are just like yours, David. David was known for having these enormous hands, and a lot of the pictures of Bobby and Eddie in the news showed their hands, and they too were enormous. And so David finally picked up a newspaper and looked at a picture of Bobby and Eddie, and sure enough, he was shocked. They looked exactly like him. And then when he read the article, it showed their birthday was July 12th, the same as his, and they were born at the same hospital he was born at. And so he's thinking, these are too many coincidences. They have to be my brothers. And so David called Eddie's home phone number, and Eddie's mother picked up and she asked who was calling. And David said, "Hi, my name is David Kelman. I was born July 12th, 1961, and I'm looking at a newspaper article of two identical twins that look just like me, and one of them is your son. I think I'm the missing third twin." After hearing this, Eddie's mom apparently dropped the phone and yelled out, "They're coming out of the woodwork!" So Eddie and Bobby went to David's house, and as soon as they walked in and saw David, they knew right away he was one of them. He was the third twin. And apparently, within minutes of meeting each other, they were wrestling and laughing hysterically on the ground. It was like, even though they were strangers, they somehow already knew each other and had an instant connection. David's family members that witnessed this first interaction said it was the most incredible thing they had ever seen, that it was just so wonderful to see these long-lost siblings finally reconnected after all these years. Shortly after David realized he was the third missing twin, Newsday did another story talking about how there was actually 3 missing twins that had all been reconnected, and once again it was just this incredible Cinderella story, and now this story went all over the world. They were on the cover of every magazine, every newspaper, they were on every talk show, and everybody had the same question: what similarities did they discover? And they would say, well, we all wrestled in junior high school and high school, we all smoked the same cigarettes, we like the same food, we had the same taste in women. And on talk shows, when they would answer these questions, it was immediately clear that they all shared the same mannerisms, and on the show, they would routinely interrupt each other and finish each other's sentences. It really was like they were the exact same person, despite having been raised completely separate from one another. The boys loved the attention they were getting. They had become international rock stars overnight, and all 3 of them were immediately so close. They were best friends right away. They moved into an apartment together. They went out partying. They met Madonna. It was just this incredible time in their lives. And so they weren't asking questions about why they had been separated in the first place. But their parents were asking a lot of questions because they had not been told by the adoption agency that the boy they were adopting actually had 2 identical siblings. They had no idea. So the boy's adoptive parents reached out to the adoption agency, which was Louise Wise Services. It's based in New York, very prestigious. Basically, the most powerful and wealthy people in New York use this adoption agency if they're going to adopt. And so the parents reached out to them and asked for a meeting so they could get some answers as to why their kids have been separated. And so the parents go to New York, they go into this meeting room with the top brass of Louise Wise Services, and they say, did you separate our sons at birth on purpose? And one of the executives said, yes, we did, because it's really hard to place 3 children into one home. At which point, David's adoptive father lashed out and said, that's absolute BS. If you had told me he had 2 identical siblings, I would have taken all 3. But the agency stood by their decision and said that's the only reason it happened, and so sorry, that's all we can tell you. And so the parents were very frustrated and felt like there was much more to the story, and in fact, they felt like the agency was actually lying to them about why they had separated their sons in the first place. But they couldn't get any more information, so they left the agency. And right when they got outside, Bobby's father realized he had left his umbrella inside of the meeting room. And so he turned around, went back inside, walked down the hall quietly so he didn't want to disturb anyone, and he opened the door to the meeting room and he reached in to get his umbrella, and he looked inside and he saw the people he had just met with from Louise Wise Services had just opened a bottle of champagne, and they were laughing and smiling, and they were clearly toasting each other on a job well done. And even though Bobby's father did not go in there and confront them about what they were celebrating, he got the sense that they were celebrating having dodged a bullet, that they clearly had just lied to the families of these 3 triplets and they'd gotten away with it. And so between the parents' general sense that the agency was clearly hiding something, and then Bobby discovering this champagne toast as soon as they left, the parents decided they needed to get in touch with some lawyers to help them get to the bottom of why their sons had been separated. And so initially, a number of really prestigious law firms in New York were excited to take this case. But shortly after, they all contacted the families to say, well, actually, there's a conflict, and we can't do it anymore. And the parents believed this was because the adoption agency, Louise Wise Services, and some of their more prominent and powerful clients were pressuring the lawyers not to dig into this, that clearly there was some secret that they did not want uncovered. And so unfortunately, the parents hit a dead end and didn't know where else to turn to try to get more information. And so over time, they kind of just accepted that this is just the way it is. And as for their sons, they didn't really care that much because the way they looked at it, at least they had each other now. And so over the years, the boys continued to stay really close. They started families of their own and had lots of family get-togethers. It was just a really happy time in all of their lives. And at some point, the boys actually went into business together and opened their own restaurant in New York called Triplets. And the first year, it was extremely successful, did over $1 million in revenue. But in the second year, the brothers started to fight with each other about how to run the restaurant. And in many ways, this was their first major conflict. They hadn't grown up together. They had never really fought. And so now they're fighting over money and how to run the business. And it got really bad really quick, and they just could not come to any sort of compromise. And so at some point, Bobby left the business. He said, I don't want to do this with you guys anymore. And apparently his departure just completely ruined the dynamic of the three brothers. Eddie was the most affected by this fracture in their relationships. All he wanted was for his brothers to be really close and for their families to spend time together. And now all of that was in jeopardy. And so Eddie started showing signs of severe depression and was ultimately hospitalized for 3 weeks. And then shortly after getting out of the hospital, he took his own life. This was beyond devastating for the two brothers and the rest of their family. Around this time, a journalist named Lawrence Wright, who had always had a fascination with identical twins, found an obscure scientific article called Psychoanalytic Study of the Child. It detailed a New York-based study about identical twins that were intentionally separated at birth and then given to different adoptive families to be studied, although it wasn't clear what they were actually studying or why they needed identical twins to do this research. In this article, Lawrence discovered all the babies that had been used in the study came from the same adoption agency, the same one the triplets had come from, the Louise Wise Services in New York. And so Lawrence called Bobby and told him that based on this article, it seems like he and his brothers were used in a scientific study. Bobby and David were totally furious. They felt like they'd been treated like lab rats. They also wondered if their being separated at birth had a negative impact on their mental health, and that might have contributed to Eddie's depression and untimely death. Lawrence wound up writing an article about this twin study he had discovered, and after he published it, another set of twins found out they had been a part of the study and discovered themselves. These two women were also struggling with depression, furthering the idea that this study could have led to irreparable harm to their subjects' mental well-being. At this point, David and Robbie did not expect anybody to be held accountable for this study. Instead, they just hoped to find out why it was done and what they were testing for and what the results were. And so they began working with Lawrence to try to get those answers. They contacted Louise Wise Services, who did admit that yes, actually this was part of a study, but they didn't give any information about what the results were or why they did it. And so they did some digging and they discovered the guy in charge of the actual scientific study was this doctor named Peter Neubauer, who was this very well-known psychologist in New York. And so Lawrence managed to get an interview with this doctor, but the doctor basically said, I won't answer any of your questions and I won't give you any information about this study. And he never published his findings. Right before the doctor died in 2008, he made sure the entire study was put under seal inside of the Yale University archives so no one could access it until 2066, which has led many people to believe that the reason he set it so far out was to guarantee all of these subjects in this study would have died by the time it was made publicly available, protecting his own legacy and the people that were involved in this study. In the recent documentary called 3 Identical Strangers, Dr. Neubauer's personal assistant, a woman by the name of Natasha Josefowicz, she was interviewed and they asked her, can you shed any light on why this study was done, what they were testing for, and what the results were? And she would say that she was not actually part of the study. She was more on the periphery, but she was privy to what they were doing. And she said the point of the study was to finally put to bed whether it was nature or nurture that made the person who they ultimately become. Basically, are your surroundings the thing that ultimately makes you who you become, or is it just your genetic makeup, that you're predestined to become a particular person independent of how you were raised? And she said the results were incredible, that basically it has nothing to do with nurture, it's all about your genetic makeup, that we unconsciously trend towards specific behaviors and decisions, but we believe it's free will. We believe we're choosing to do certain things, but in reality, it's basically predetermined. And specifically, in the triplets case, Bobby was intentionally placed into a more affluent household where his father was a doctor and his mother was a lawyer, and so they were very well educated, and that was his upbringing. Eddie was placed into a more middle-class family with his father being a teacher and his mom being a stay-at-home mother. And David was put into a low-income household where they were all immigrants, English was a second language, and they just had this very small shop that they owned. And Natasha said this study demonstrated that despite these boys being put into different socioeconomic levels, it had almost no impact on who they ultimately became. She said she doesn't know why the study wasn't published, but she hopes someday it will be. Also, in this documentary, a doctor named Lawrence Perlman, who was actually one of the researchers in the study that would actually make house visits to each of the boys' houses as they were growing up under the false pretext that they were there as part of routine follow-up for the adoption agency. And he went on record and said that the study was not just about the effects of socioeconomic class, it was really about the effects of different styles of parenting. He said in the triplets case, each of the boys had been placed into their respective households after that household had already adopted another child. And that first child they adopted effectively became the guinea pig for this study, where scientists would come in and they would study this child under the false pretext that they were there just following up for the adoption agency, but really they were creating a baseline of how do these parents parent. And then once that baseline was established, then the triplets were sent into their respective homes, with the researchers knowing full well how they were each going to be brought up, with the adoptive father being the X factor. Bobby's father, who was a doctor, was rarely around, but he was devoted and loving to his son. David's father, who was the shop owner, was around all the time and adored his son and loved him unconditionally. Eddie's father was a teacher who was around a fair amount, but when he was very strict and rough with Eddie and quick to discipline him and rarely showed any affection for him. And while Dr. Perlman does not come out and say that Eddie's relationship with his father probably had an effect on him becoming depressed and ultimately taking his life, there are many other people close to this case that believe that's exactly what it was, that David and Bobby had a stable, healthy upbringing and Eddie did not. And so when he was faced with the crisis of the brothers separating, Eddie couldn't handle it. These same people refute what Natasha said about the findings of the study that we're all genetically predisposed to become a particular person. They say if that was the case, then why haven't David and Bobby taken their lives? But ultimately, because the study was never published, we won't know for sure why it was done, what they studied, and what the conclusions were. All we have is speculation and second and third hand information. But what we do know for sure is these surviving triplets and their families are furious that this study was done. They feel like it ruined their lives. Following the release of the documentary 3 Identical Strangers, Bobby and David were actually granted early access to the study that was sealed inside of Yale University. And when they looked at it, they were expecting to be blown away with the results, but it turned out it was over 10,000 pages of very technical information, and much of it was heavily redacted, so they couldn't even read most of it. They were not able to deduce what the purpose of the study was in the first place, or what it accomplished. It was just all very ambiguous. This study was ultimately shut down permanently in 1980, the same year the triplets discovered themselves. As for the adoption agency, Louise Wise Services, and all the scientists and researchers involved in the study, none of them were held accountable for their role in this totally unethical study, and so basically everything was swept under the rug. And so Bobby, David, and all of the family members of the triplets were just left with a whole bunch of questions and not a lot of answers. On December 18th, 1956, a brand new game show called To Tell the Truth aired on a major American television network. The premise of the show was relatively simple. 4 celebrity judges would be presented with 3 people called contestants who all claimed to be the same person. And this person who they claimed to be was always remarkable in some way. They had some incredible talent or some crazy job, or they had accomplished something extraordinary. One of these 3 contestants was the real person they were claiming to be. The other 2 people were doing their best to pretend to be that person. And it was the job of the celebrity judges to try to figure out who was telling the truth. So for a set amount of time on the show, the celebrity judges would ask the contestants questions about their background and try to figure out, who was who. And then at the end of the time, the celebrities would cast a vote about who they thought was the real remarkable person. After the votes were tallied up, the host would have the real remarkable person stand up to reveal themselves, and the entire audience would go crazy, and that was the show. And the show became quite popular. So popular, in fact, that today, nearly 70 years later, it's still on the air. And over this show's very long history, virtually all the episodes are pretty similar. It's a pretty redundant show. But there is one episode that will forever go down as the most unique. In October of 1972, 3 contestants walked out onto the stage in front of the 4 celebrity judges, and they all introduced themselves as Ed Edwards. Then the host of the show read aloud the biography of the real Ed Edwards, and he would say that Ed at one point was on the FBI's list of the top 10 most wanted criminals in America for crimes like armed robbery and impersonating a federal officer, and then after he was finally caught by law enforcement and went to prison, a prison guard helped him turn his life around, and then upon release from prison 14 years later, Ed remained this reformed criminal and became a successful author and motivational speaker who specialized in telling people how to identify con men and criminals and how to protect themselves from these people. After the real Ed Edwards biography was read aloud, the 3 contestants sat down and the celebrity judges began asking them questions about their past, and then after the time was up, the celebrities cast their votes, and then the real Ed Edwards was revealed.
Will the real Ed Edwards please stand up?
And even though 2 of the 4 celebrity judges had correctly identified the right Ed Edwards, the crowd was totally astonished at who this guy actually was, because he did not look like this ex-convict. He looked like this kind of all-American, middle-aged father who was totally harmless and wouldn't hurt a fly. But either way, the show ended, and then the world forgot about Ed Edwards until 2009. That year, Ed's estranged daughter, 40-year-old April Blasio, finally decided to investigate something that had plagued her for her whole childhood. Despite her father's claims that he was this reformed criminal and this stand-up, law-abiding guy, she didn't believe it. She never believed it. She thought he had never been reformed and just was a criminal and always had been. Behind closed doors, Ed was violent and abusive, and he was a compulsive liar. She remembered in the 1970s and 80s when she was a young kid, Ed would make their family pack up and move sometimes in the middle of the night, and April always assumed it was because her dad was wrapped up in something criminal. But every time she asked him, he would say, oh, well, I was an informant when I was in jail and I snitched on some people, and some of those people have figured out where we live, and so we gotta move. April knew he was lying, but there was nothing she could do, and so they just kept on moving around. But she always thought something else was going on. So in 2009, when April is now this 40-year-old woman, she's laying in bed one night and finally says, you know what, I'm just gonna start Googling some stuff. So she hops in her laptop and she starts typing in the different names of towns that she and her family lived in as a kid. And then after she'd write the name of the town, she'd write unsolved mystery or unsolved crime, and she would see if anything popped up. And so as she began looking, she found one in 1980. It was an unsolved murder in a town called Watertown, Wisconsin, that happened right around the time that her family very briefly lived in this town. There was this young teenage couple that had left this wedding and they had driven down this dead-end road, and they were just kind of enjoying each other's company when an unknown assailant who matched the description of Ed Edwards walked up to their car, broke in, shot them both to death, and then disappeared. And so on a hunch, April called the Watertown Police Department the following day and told them that, I think my father might have been responsible for this double homicide. It's just a hunch, but he matches the description. We were there in this very small window of time when it happened. And so the police said, okay, we'll go have a look. And so the Watertown police, they tracked down Ed Edwards, who was living in Kentucky at the time, and they got him to give them a DNA sample. And when they tested the DNA sample, it matched the samples that were taken at the crime scene in 1980. And so Ed Edwards, he was arrested and brought back to Wisconsin, and as soon as he was in custody, he confessed to the murder. And then he requested the death penalty. but he was told the maximum punishment for this crime was life in prison. Ed didn't like this, and so he confessed to another double homicide from 1977 in Ohio, where he killed another teenage couple, thinking that would give him the death penalty. But through a loophole, they said, well, actually, that still won't get you the death penalty. You're still facing life in prison. And so frustrated, Ed revealed a third murder he had perpetrated. In 1996, he had killed his own foster son for the insurance money. And so for this crime, he was eligible for capital punishment, and so he was sentenced to death. But he would die of natural causes 2 years later in 2011 before the state could execute him. Since his death, cold case investigators and members of his own family have theorized that Ed Edwards is almost certainly responsible for more killings beyond just the 5 he happened to confess to. In fact, many people believe Ed Edwards could actually be the infamous Zodiac Killer, who's one of the nation's most notorious uncaught serial killers that killed 37 people in Northern California in the 1960s and 1970s. If this is true, then Ed Edwards did not become a killer after he was on that game show in 1972. No, when he showed up for that game show and stood in front of the audience and smiled and answered questions to the celebrity panelists, at that time, as you're watching him on TV, he would have already been a seasoned serial killer with dozens and dozens of victims. But Ed stopped confessing to murders after that third confession because he was just kind of using those murders as bargaining chips to get what he wanted, the death penalty. And once he got it, he went silent. And now that he's dead, we're never going to get another confession out of him, and there's no proof connecting him to any unsolved murder cases. And so unfortunately, it's unlikely we'll ever know the full extent of Ed's reign of terror. On the afternoon of Friday, February 7th, 2003, a 52-year-old woman named Monique Lejeune cleared the table after lunch at her house in Cologne, France. Her husband, Claude, and 2 of her adult sons, Franck and Pascal, were at the table. And while Monique cleaned up, the men talked over what they needed to pack for the overnight trip they were about to take. They were heading to a family gathering near Paris, about 3.5 hours away, to celebrate Claude's sister-in-law's retirement. Monique was not going to go, and she had told her family it was because somebody had to stay home with their 4 dogs. And that was true, but there also was another real reason why Monique did not want to be there. And it was because she just didn't get along very well with Claude's family. So Monique and Claude had gotten married almost 20 years earlier, but at the time they both already had multiple kids from previous marriages. Monique had 3 boys, and Claude had 5 girls. And for a while, the 2 halves of the blended family had gotten along quite well. But over time, there were some personality clashes between Monique and her 5 stepdaughters. When Monique and Claude got married, all 5 girls were at least teenagers, if not in their 20s. And so while they sort of accepted Monique as being part of their lives, they just couldn't view her as an actual motherly figure. You know, they were already close with their actual mother, Claude's ex-wife Beatrice, and so that was their mother, and Monique was like the add-on. Then, in 1993, one of Claude's grandsons, so one of his daughter's children, had accused Monique's eldest son, Jean-Luc, of sexually abusing him, and that had completely ripped the family apart. Now, this was never reported to the police, so there was no actual investigation into whether this really happened or not, but Claude's 5 daughters and Claude's ex-wife Beatrice had fully believed the grandson. And Monique had defended her son, Jean-Luc, and Claude was kind of stuck in the middle of it. And it had gotten so ugly that the 2 sides of the family had just stopped talking to each other for a whole year. And so now the whole family was basically back on speaking terms as they were getting ready for this retirement party, but it was still extremely uncomfortable and tense. And so that is why Monique was not going to go, and also why her son, Jean-Luc, was not going to go as well. Finally, around 3 p.m., as Claude and the 2 sons wheeled their suitcases out to the car, Monique went to the front door and she said goodbye to them and then watched as they hopped in the car and drove off. A few hours later, around 6:30 p.m., Monique heard a knock on the front door, and when she opened it, it was her son Jean-Luc, and he was standing there holding up his bicycle. He told his mom he was just stopping by on his way home from work. And she said, "Great, come on in." And so Jean-Luc left his bike outside and he walked in, and As he was taking off his coat, he mentioned to his mother that her neighbor across the street, whose name was Henri, had clearly been watching Jean-Luc when he rolled up, like he was basically spying on him. And Monique actually kind of was spooked by that, because Henri was a bit of a loose cannon. For example, anytime anybody parked their car in front of Henri's house, he would shamelessly vandalize their vehicle by slashing their tires or pouring oil all over their car. I mean, the guy just didn't care. In fact, over the years, there had been several heated arguments between Monique and her sons and Henri about parking. And in fact, one of those arguments had even escalated into a physical fight. But since Jean-Luc had shown up tonight without a car, he rode his bike here, Monique just hoped that, whatever issues Henri had, that it wouldn't go anywhere, because there's no car in front of his property, like, we didn't do anything, leave us alone. Monique led her son into the kitchen, where she poured 2 glasses of sparkling wine, and then the two just sat there and chatted for about half an hour, and then Monique gave her son a haircut, and then around 7:05, Jean-Luc said goodbye to his mom. He went outside, hopped on his bike, which had not had its tires slashed by Henri, and he left to go to his apartment with his wife to have dinner. After Jean-Luc was gone, Monique just sort of went about her evening. She corralled the dogs behind a baby gate at the base of the stairs and then fed them, and then she went into the kitchen and began cooking dinner for herself. But then, a little while later, at around 7:30 p.m., Monique heard another knock on the door. And she knew it very likely was not her son, and so as she walked down the hallway to answer it, she just hoped it wasn't Henri. The following morning, the woman who lived next door to Monique woke up feeling pretty tired. She hadn't slept well because someone's dogs in the neighborhood had been barking all night. She got out of bed and walked over to the window and opened up the blinds, and as her eyes adjusted to the light that was flooding in, she looked down from her second-floor window into the yard of the 2-story white house that was next door, Monique's house. And the neighbor saw there was something dark in the middle of the walkway that led to the front door of Monique's house. And so the neighbor, she put her face right up to the window and she squinted to get a better look. And she realized what she was seeing was a body lying face down on the pavement. And so in a panic, this woman ran out of her room, grabbed the phone, and called the police. A couple hours later, Judiciary Police Captain Anne Preem pulled up in front of a white 2-story house with crime scene tape and a medical examiner's van right out front. As Preem got out of her car, a police officer walked over to her and led her to where the body of a woman was lying out in the front yard. The officer told Preem that the victim, Monique Lejeune, had been discovered exactly like this by her neighbors earlier that morning. And based on the progression of rigor mortis, the medical examiner estimated that Monique had likely died between 8 p.m. and midnight the night before. Preem bent down to get a better look at the body, but even before getting up close, she knew this woman had sustained just gruesome injuries. There was blood all over Monique's face and her clothes, and her torso appeared completely ripped apart by what appeared to be stab wounds. Preem guessed, just from looking at the scene, that this woman must have been murdered and likely was stabbed, just at first glance, at least a dozen times. Preem also noticed pretty obvious defense wounds all over Monique's hands and forearms, which certainly suggested again that she was murdered and that Monique had put up a pretty good fight against her killer. And so after a few more moments of just kind of looking over the body, Preem stood back up and asked the officer if the neighbors had seen or heard anything unusual the night before. And the officer said no, aside from the fact that Monique's dogs, she had 4 dogs, had been barking nonstop really the whole night, starting at around 8 p.m. Preem nodded and thanked the officer, and then she made her way over to the front door of the house to look to see if there was any signs of forced entry, as the door was closed. When she got there, she didn't see any signs, but she did see a bloody handprint on the outside wall near the door. And then, when Preem turned the handle of the door and opened it up, she saw this hallway inside that was absolutely covered in blood. And so Preem very carefully stepped inside, trying to avoid stepping in the blood or tracking any prints anywhere, and she began walking down the hallway very carefully and looking in other rooms. And she saw that for the most part, the blood spatter was pretty well contained in the entryway, which told her that the attack on Monique likely began and ended in the entryway. And so her running theory was, okay, Monique must have had someone come to the door, they knocked or whatever, and then Monique opened the door and was attacked immediately. But then, as Prem stepped back outside, she looked down at the front walkway and noticed something kind of unusual. Despite all the blood right inside the front door, there was no blood at all on the walkway between the door and the spot where Monique's body was found. And just from the amount of blood that the victim had clearly lost inside the house, Prem doubted that she would have been capable of running out into the yard after the attack. So she had to wonder if maybe the body had been moved post-mortem. And Monique was a large woman, so if her killer had been able to overpower her, one, and then also move her body such a far distance after she was dead, Prem assumed that whoever her killer was likely pretty strong. In fact, Prem just kind of assumed that the killer had to be a big, strong man. However, what Prem didn't understand was why would the killer want to drag a corpse out into the yard where the neighbors could see them? Unless, for some reason, they wanted Monique to be found as soon as possible. And since at least at this point, it appeared like Monique likely had gone to the front door and opened the door for her killer, Prem thought that the killer must be someone that she knew. Around noon on that same day, so February 8th, 2003, Police Captain Anne Prem was about to go next door and speak to one of Monique's neighbors herself when suddenly a car pulled up at the curb and 3 men climbed out looking completely shocked and very concerned. By this point, Prem had learned from the neighbors that Monique had a husband and also adult sons, and so Prem assumed that these men must be them. So right away, Prem hurried down the walkway to cut the men off, to keep them from entering the crime scene. And the 3 men, they just began crowding around her, asking her, like, what's going on? Where's Monique? What's happened? And she told them that, unfortunately, Monique had been stabbed to death. And at first, all 3 of them just went completely silent. And then one of them, one of the sons, just began to cry. Prem then told them that they couldn't go into the house because it was still an active crime scene. So instead, she led them over to the curb and they all sat down. Prem could tell the men were in shock because as much as one man was crying, it just seemed like they couldn't even process what they were told. But it was important to find out what Monique's family knew as soon as possible. So Prem pulled out a notepad and gently asked them about the last time they had seen Monique. The husband, Claude, said that they had all left the house around 3 p.m. the previous afternoon, leaving Monique at home alone. They said they had gone to a family gathering near Paris that evening and stayed overnight, and they'd only now just gotten back into town and they'd seen this whole scene out front, the police tape and police, they had no idea what was going on. Eventually, Prem asked Claude to tell him all the names of all the people in their family, all their adult children, Claude's ex-wife, Monique's ex-husband, everybody. But as Claude was giving this information, he told her that he just couldn't imagine anybody in the family being involved in this. Prem nodded, but she knew that it was entirely possible that family was involved. I mean, unfortunately, this stuff does happen. But she didn't give that off. Instead, she just said, well, can you think of anyone who would want to hurt Monique? And Claude thought about it and just said no. She lived a pretty normal and uneventful life. But then one of the sons piped up and mentioned that actually there might be someone. He said her neighbor, Henri, and he pointed across the street at the house. A minute later, Prem was knocking on the front door of Henri's house. And after a few seconds, a middle-aged man answered the door. And he was very curious about what was going on across the street. And eventually, Prem told him that, well, your neighbor Monique has been murdered. And when she said that, Henri smiled. So immediately, alarm bells are going off in Prem's head. She's thinking this guy is very suspicious. And she asked him, can I come in and look around then? And Henri didn't even seem surprised by this request. It was like he already knew he was going to be looked at as a suspect and said, sure, come on in. So he stepped aside and Prem came in and began searching every room in the house, the living room, the kitchen, the upstairs bedrooms. But despite looking everywhere, she didn't find any traces of blood or really anything else suspicious or unusual. So eventually, Prem made her way back into the living room where Henri was waiting, and she asked him, where were you the previous evening? And he told her very casually that, well, he and his wife were home. They were here. Prem thought this was a pretty weak alibi, but she made a mental note to follow up with the wife and confirm it later. Next, Prem asked Henri if he had seen or heard anything out of the ordinary the night before. And Henri said no, except that maybe around 7 p.m., he had seen one of Monique's sons leaving her house on his bicycle. And at this, Prime perked up because the family had told her that Monique had a third adult son named Jean-Luc, who had not gone to that party in Paris. And if Henri was telling the truth, it meant that Jean-Luc was very likely the last person to see Monique alive. And maybe he was even the killer. The next morning, Prime led a forensics team up the stairs of a rundown apartment building in a sketchy part of town. She knocked on the door to Jean-Luc's apartment, and a moment later, a young man answered. After confirming that he was Jean-Luc, 2 officers led him away to be questioned back at the station. Meanwhile, Prime went in with the forensics team to search his apartment. And pretty quickly, as Prime was walking around the living room, one of the other officers called her over to look at something. And so she walked over to him, and she saw he had his flashlight out and he was pointing it at something on the wall. And when she got close enough, she could see that what he was highlighting were what appeared to be tiny drops of blood. And so Prime pulled out her flashlight, and she too began scouring the walls and the floor near the stairs, looking for any more blood. And she found a few more red droplets near the doorknob to a closet. And so she opened the closet up, and inside was a bike. And she shined her flashlight on the bike, on the wheels and the frame, and she saw all these reddish-brown splatters all over the underside of it, as if whoever had ridden this bike last had basically drove through a puddle of blood. An hour later, Prime walked into an interrogation room at the police station where Jean-Luc was sitting with his head in his hands. He looked up as she entered, and he had this very scared and confused expression on his face. Prime sat down across from him and right away asked him what he had been doing at his mother's house on the night of February 7th. Jean-Luc said he had just stopped by after work, as he often did, and he only stayed for maybe half an hour before riding his bike back home. When Prime asked him if he had gone straight home afterwards, Jean-Luc said no, he hadn't. He explained that his wife's brother, Christophe Gressier, lived in the same apartment building as they did on the floor right below them. So before going up to his own unit, he said he just stopped by to chat with Christophe for a few minutes, and then after that, he spent the rest of the night in his own apartment with his wife. However, to Prime, she felt like there had to be more to this story, because they had found what appeared to be droplets of blood sort of scattered throughout Jean-Luc's apartment, and then, there was blood, or at least what appeared to be blood, on the underside of his bike. And so she figured, maybe if she pushed hard enough, she might be able to get him to change his story. So she told him point blank they had found blood in his living room, and they were now sending it to the lab for analysis. And when Jean-Luc heard this, his face went bright red, and he began stammering that the blood was very likely from a neighbor who had injured himself while visiting a few days earlier. Prime nodded, but then told him, they'd also found blood sort of all over his bike. And Jean-Luc, he sort of hesitated and stuttered and stammered, but really couldn't come up with any way to explain that. At this point, Prime felt like she had Jean-Luc right where she wanted him. So she just told him to be quiet for a second and just roll up your sleeves so she could look at his arms. Prime knew, based on the defensive wounds on Monique's body, that she likely had fought back really hard, and she must have left at least a few scrapes or bruises on her killer. However, when Jean-Luc finally, rolled up his sleeves, Prime didn't see a single scratch or bruise on his hands or arms. A few minutes later, Prime left the interrogation room and walked to her office. Despite the lack of defensive wounds, Jean-Luc was definitely still acting suspicious, and she was not ready to let him go. But she also didn't want to get tunnel vision and completely ignore any other suspects, in case the blood inside of Jean-Luc's apartment did turn out to just be a big coincidence. So she sat down at her desk, and she opened up a file, and she began flipping through the notes of interviews that her team had already done with the rest of Monique's family and her neighbors. Monique's sons had mentioned in their interviews that there was definitely some tension between Monique and her 5 stepdaughters. But officers had spoken to all the stepdaughters as well as their husbands, and even though some of the women had admitted they still had an issue with Monique, they all had alibis, both the women and their husbands, for the night that Monique was killed. Also, several other family members had mentioned that Claude's ex-wife, Beatrice, definitely did not get along with Monique. But officers had tracked down Beatrice, and she just didn't seem like a very strong suspect. Beatrice had said, for the most part, she and Monique, even if they didn't get along, they just stayed out of each other's way, and that they hadn't seen each other in over a month. And also, Beatrice was remarkably tiny and frail. She was barely 4 foot 9 inches tall and 58 years old and just seemed really weak. So it just seemed almost impossible that she could have overpowered the much larger Monique and inflicted the injuries that were inflicted on her and then dragged her out to the front yard. It just seemed sort of impossible. And so, even though she wasn't totally ruled out, for the most part she was. Just then, there was a knock on Preem's door, and when she looked up, she saw there was another officer standing there. And he told her there were 2 people here who wanted to speak to her. Preem nodded, and then a moment later, a very nervous-looking middle-aged man and woman came into the office. They sat down across the desk from Preem, and the man said they had information that could help with the Monique Lejeune investigation. Preem sat up and grabbed a notepad and said, "Okay, tell me what you got." And she began writing as the man explained that he was a co-worker of Christophe Gressier. And Preem immediately recognized that that was the name of Jean-Luc's brother-in-law, the one Jean-Luc said he had visited on the night Monique was killed. That was the person he saw apparently right after he left Monique's house. The man sitting across from Preem said that just a few hours ago, he'd gotten a call from Christophe's number. But when he answered it, all he could hear was a sort of muffled conversation between 2 women. And at first, this man thought what he was hearing was just an accidental call, maybe by Christophe's kid who was just pressing buttons at random. However, the man said when he put his phone on speaker, he and his wife, who was the woman he was with, they both started listening really closely, and they were able to make out a snippet of the conversation. The 2 women on the line were clearly talking about needing an alibi and saying something about a man named Jean-Luc. First, the women had said something like, "It's not Jean-Luc's fault, he's depressed." And then the women had mentioned something about a pair of pants that needed to be washed. Preem couldn't believe what she was hearing. I mean, any doubts that she had had about Jean-Luc being the killer pretty much disappeared. And so she took down the couple's names and contact info, showed them out of her office, and then once they were gone, she grabbed her keys and she headed out to go to Christophe's apartment. Now, by this point, Christophe had already been taken into custody and questioned, and he had completely denied knowing anything about Monique's murder or the phone call that was apparently made from his number. But Preem hoped that maybe a search of his apartment would tell a different story. She walked through each room of the apartment until she found the washing machine. And there, she put on a pair of latex gloves, and she reached inside the washing machine, and she pulled out a pair of pants that were still damp, as if they had just been washed earlier that day. And she held these pants up and kind of put them in the light, and she could see clearly there was a brownish stain on them. She also noticed that these pants looked like they'd be way too small for Christophe, who was a pretty tall and burly guy. But they definitely looked like they would fit a guy like Jean-Luc, who was much smaller. Later that same day, so this is on February 10th, 2 days after Monique's body was found, Captain Preem was in her office when her phone rang. She answered it, and it was a technician from the crime lab telling her they actually already had the results from the samples that had been sent in for testing. And so Preem, she's geared up, ready to hear some potentially, case-breaking news. But the tech told her that the stains that were on the bike, it was blood, but it was animal blood. He went on to say that the other little droplets of blood that were in Jean-Luc's apartment, like on the walls and near the door handle of the closet, it was blood, but not a match for Monique's. And then also those pants that had been found, that stain on the pants, that wasn't blood at all. That stain was just grease. Preem was very frustrated because in her mind, she had sort of zeroed in on Jean-Luc. It really seemed like he was their guy. But now they really had no physical evidence against him. And as for that bizarre phone call to Christophe's coworker, they really had no way of knowing who those 2 women in the background were, or even if the coworker and his wife had actually overheard the conversation correctly, about the alibi and about Jean-Luc being depressed. Who knows if they actually heard that. So Preem thanked the lab technician for calling with the update, despite how disappointing it was, and she was about to hang up when he told her to wait, because he had one more piece of news for her. He told her that during Monique's autopsy, the medical examiner had actually found DNA under Monique's fingernails, and it was very likely skin cells from her killer that had been scratched off during the struggle. The technician said it would take at least another few weeks to analyze it, but once the results came back, they could definitely test it against DNA samples from any of their suspects, and maybe it would be a match. This definitely gave Preem some hope. And after she hung up, she began making a list of everyone they would need to get a DNA sample from so they could test against it. She definitely knew she would need one from Jean-Luc and Christophe, and then also that neighbor Henri seemed like a strong suspect too. Preem had actually spoken to Henri's wife and confirmed that, at least according to her, they were together that whole night Monique was killed, but she also knew that spouses were very likely to lie for each other, so it was a flimsy alibi. So at this point, Preem felt like she definitely had 3 good potential suspects to get DNA from. But realistically, that was where her list ended. The rest of Monique's family had been ruled out by this point, and none of the other neighbors really seemed like suspects. And by all accounts, Monique lived a pretty quiet suburban life and just didn't really get into trouble with anyone, so there really was no one else. And so to Preem, it just felt like something was missing here. Like, in the time I have between now and when the analysis is done on that DNA underneath Monique's fingernails, I need to see if there's something I've missed. And so over the next few weeks, that's what Preem did. She pored over all the evidence they'd collected, and she re-interviewed all the family members and spoke to all the neighbors. But despite this huge effort, nothing new came up that brought any other suspects into view. However, at the same time, this is early March by this point, maybe 3-4 weeks after the tech had said they would test this DNA, Preem got another call from the crime lab, and the technician said that the DNA analysis had come back. And even before they tested it against any specific suspects, the results were already enough to narrow down the field significantly. And when Preem heard what the tech had to say about the analysis so far, she realized that this was, in fact, the missing piece of information that she needed. Based on this revelatory DNA evidence and also an eventual confession by the killer, this is what police believe happened to Monique Lejeune on the night of February 7th, 2003. The killer walked up to Monique's front door and knocked, and a few seconds later, the door opened and Monique was standing there. But instead of inviting the killer inside, Monique just kind of crossed her arms and stared. At this point, the killer began to speak. However, what was supposed to be a polite conversation quickly escalated into an argument, with both of them hurling insults back and forth. And then at some point, Monique slammed the door in the killer's face, but before she did, she said one last thing that was apparently so inflammatory that it pushed the killer over the edge. And so without even stopping to consider what they were doing, the killer, after having the door slammed in their face and hearing this totally inflammatory line, they stormed over to their vehicle, which was parked nearby, and they grabbed the knife they kept under their seat for self-defense. And they carried that knife right back to the front door and knocked again. And as soon as the door opened, the killer pushed their way inside, and with a surge of rage, they just started stabbing. But Monique was very strong and big, and she knocked the killer to the ground and actually pinned them there. But the killer managed to wrestle their arm free that was holding the knife. But Monique, she kept fighting back. I mean, this was an epic struggle. And also, the whole time this is happening, Monique's 4 dogs have basically come over to the gate, which butted up against the entryway, and they're watching this happen. And they're barking like mad, and Monique is screaming out in rage and panic and pain, until finally they were able to break away from Monique, who kind of had them pinned, despite, getting stabbed repeatedly. And then once the killer was free, they turned and bolted out of the house. The killer ran across the yard, got in their vehicle, began pulling away, and as they did that, they saw Monique stumble out the front door. She took a few steps down the walkway and collapsed to the ground. But the killer didn't wait around to see if she was really dead. Instead, they sped away. And then they stopped at a supermarket parking lot and threw the murder weapon, the knife, in a trash can. And then the killer went home, and they burned their blood-stained clothes in their stove. They thought that would be enough to destroy any evidence linking them to this crime, especially considering the fact that they knew they were like the last person anybody would suspect of such a horrible, violent murder. It would turn out the killer was the 4-foot, 9-inch tall, tiny, frail Beatrice Matisse, Claude's 58-year-old ex-wife. In her confession to police, she claimed she had gone to Monique's house that night to finally, bury the hatchet after years of feuding between the two sides of Claude's family. But she said the bad blood ran way too deep, and when Monique apparently insulted Beatrice's daughters, that was the last inflammatory line as she shut the door, Beatrice said she snapped. Beatrice had actually been ruled out as a suspect primarily because she was really, really small, like too small to have overpowered Monique and then to have potentially moved her body out to the front yard. But it would turn out Monique's body was not moved at all. She stumbled out herself. Monique was apparently so full of adrenaline after getting attacked that she had managed to, chase Beatrice out of the house before she collapsed and died. And keep in mind, she did that after being stabbed over 50 times and losing an immense amount of blood inside. And because Monique had fought back so fiercely, she had managed to get traces of Beatrice's DNA under her fingernails. And so right away, the DNA analysis showed that their killer was a woman. And further testing eventually confirmed that it was a match for Beatrice. Investigators never figured out who made that bizarre phone call to Christophe's coworker, but their best guess was that the women that were heard on the phone call were Christophe's mother and sister. And it was just an innocent conversation about Monique's murder that the coworker misinterpreted. Beatrice Matisse was arrested on March 29, 2003, and she confessed to the murder immediately, although she later recanted the confession. She was eventually found guilty and sentenced to 15 years in jail. Hey everyone, just a reminder, I'm going on tour this year, which means if you go, you can experience never-before-heard stories from me live and in person. We did this in 2024 and people loved it. So get your tickets today at tour.ballenstudios.com right now before they sell out. That's tour.ballenstudios.com. I can't wait to see you all at the shows. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.